There we go. I didn't hit live, but like YouTube lets me know beforehand. Uh,
Mm.
Hello
All right.
everyone. Welcome to the stream, and we're gonna wait for a little bit just so everyone can click on the video and stuff.
Wait until some people start showing up.
Well, I mean, it says it's live on my end, so that's good.
Yeah, it started on my end, so I know that we're live.
Sweet.
Hey everybody.
So, I think this is the part where the topic gets introduced.
Yeah, like basically, since we're gonna wait until people come in, like we're actually going to respond to Shane Killian's video, "What is Capitalism?" because I found major flaws with it. He's depending on an entire like mainstream article, which actually is wrong.
We
And
can. All right. Sorry. I'll let you finish. I thought you were done.
oh, you're fine. Basically, uh, yeah, that's basically what we're here for, is to correct Shane's video on what is capitalism.
The main reason this is being brought up, as far as I'm aware, by the way, I'm Filthy Heretic. Hello, everybody. Is because although this video was made in July 2020, he's being Shane is still unironically attempting to push this as the go-to platonic truth, unequivocal fact, dictionary definition as to what is capitalism. If you attempt to discuss the topic that even touches upon capitalism, and there is a hint that you could be interpreting capitalism in a way that he might disagree with, you are required to do your homework and go watch this 26-minute video just to be able to discuss the topic on the terms that he agrees with.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify. To begin with. Since we are just, I guess, prefacing the stream before we begin the response, my interest personally is, I guess, the same as heretics, because in that anytime anyone criticizes the concept of capitalism or raises questions as far as whether or not libertarians should be associating with the concept of capitalism, or, more specifically, as far as our objection to it is concerned, whether or not you can consider concept of a market as it would emerge in a libertarian end. So, in the absence of any sort of political planning, can you consider this to be capitalism based on the methodological framework which informs capitalism, or what informs the concept itself? And anytime anyone even so much as starts discussing this topic, Shane, instead of trying to discuss the foundations of his methodology, or even clarifying what his methodology is, or like why he considers it to be valid, he just links this video to people in his server, or to video, or in response videos that he makes to various people. And considering that I've been trying to, it's probably not going to happen at this point, but since as far back as at least December of 2019, I've been trying to organize a debate quietly with Shane in the background, about methodology, specifically the concepts of thin versus thick libertarianism. And he has been that he's been telling me every time that I bring it up to him that he's busy, and anytime that I tried then to create a schedule that we could discuss this around, he simply started ignoring me. So I don't know whether or not he was blowing me off, but considering it's been 2.5 years, yeah, I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume that there's a pretty good chance he might have been. But
Uh,
in either case, I suppose this gives me an opportunity to finally present some of the points that I have in a format where he'll be seeing it.
Well,
yeah.
and I imagine that this will actually probably prompt him to want to debate you because after outlining basically
I don't
a
know
good
about
chunk of
that.
your case, well, we'll see. One or two things will happen. Either one, he'll see that he'll have no foundation to stand on, in which case he'll most likely make a response video just in an attempt to mischaracterize your points entirely without having to address you directly and to prevent you from being able to correct him in real time. Or two, he'll just try to avoid it. Now, I'm not going to say whether or not he's doing so with cowardly intentions or just simply thinking that it's just not worth his time. I'm not going to speculate on that, though. Uh, it'll be fun to see his response nonetheless. Though there's also the possibility that he could actually just be like, "Hey, yeah, let's debate." Because now I understand your positions entirely, and I have the perfect citation that will debunk your excuse me, that will debunk your entire argument.
Well, again, we'll get into that once we begin the video, but
Yep.
I seriously I seriously doubt that he will. Not just because we've been banned from his servers because someone we're not mentioning on the stream. Uh, because we're not going to give him any attention. Got mad that we were making fun of him and banned us. But also, the fact that he's been putting off debating me for the last 2.5 years and just pretending that there isn't any sort of point of contention to address. I He keeps treating this, even though I've made it expressly clear in any of my conversations with him, as though this is a semantic argument. And granted, I don't know whether or not this is because he just doesn't understand argumentation, which, given how he talks to people in his Discord server, there's a very good chance that that may just be the case, that he doesn't understand anything beyond talking about subjects in social study outside of a political context where basically everyone agrees on what informs a concept. That is, there is nothing that informs a concept. It's just whatever the movement considers the concept to be is what it is. And I don't know if it's just this or if it's no. I just don't see it happening. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
It's probably not going to happen, and he'll probably only. I might be mischaracterizing things, but he'll probably only let you on if either one, he can use you as a framing device for his own arguments, or two, you agree with him entirely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he bans literally anybody that starts trying to argue points that would require him to justify his methodological framework. I mean,
It's
that's
got it's not just us either. We've had people in the back alley who are refugees from Shane's server because they have a particular contention with his methodology or his argumentation or, well, really anything. And because him and the various paleos and literal federal agents that make up his mod staff have any kind of slight disagreement, that's basically a grounds for banning.
Oh, and that is the train of thought that I was, that had escaped me for a second there. I was about to continue on. Uh, is that because he doesn't want to discuss methodology, it makes it impossible for any genuine argumentation to occur in his server. And I mean, it's a big part of the reason why we weren't really active in there. But considering that one of the few times we decided to pop in there, it ended up causing us to get banned. That should tell you about the third point of contention that I've had with him recently, which is I used to have a bit more respect. I used to have a lot of respect for him. It's just because of my own lack of understanding and also my understanding of libertarianism as something that's political and the philosophical movement being interchangeable with just libertarianism in general. And yeah, I see him doing things like banning people for having these kind of conversations and just automatically just describing retroactively anyone who tries to raise these contentions as people who are approaching in bad faith, coupled with something we can't even really go into detail here on YouTube about because it would get Gavi's stream yeeted. Given that is the case, I'm sure you could guess what particular subject that is. But since about 2020, he has been putting out some particularly objectionable takes, specifically because of his approach to methodological analysis. That I don't think I can't really fuck with any any community that or any person that tries to promote these views.
Uh, yeah, and basically, uh, Nate, you want to share your story on when you entered Shane's VC?
I merely went in mostly just for laughs. However, I knew that I was going to get banned regardless. So I just went in there and pretty much laid out my case from the perspective as a mutualist myself. Um, and so uh, after a while, it eventually. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but eventually it just got to the point where they, it's like he didn't like how I was framing my arguments or how I was or how I was saying it or whatever. So it just got to the point where he just completely banned me. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
All right, but one of the most and we're not going to get too much into it, but one of the most disastrous consequences of not having any sort of basis for you characterize concept how Shane characterizes these concepts is that it also makes it incredibly easy for various types of infiltrators who do not have good faith intentions in mind to slip into his server and complete and push actively subversive messages or grift off of the community and start a bunch of toxic bullshit like the particular mod in question who banned Heretic and that's why we were making fun of him. Uh, or it just makes it so no what even counts as a concept in libertarianism is up for debate. And unless you have some sort of grounding for in a particular, especially in a philosophical movement, what these are, there is nothing that allows anybody else within this internal reasoning, that there's nothing that stops them from coming along and making any other claims about libertarianism or characterization of concepts they claim are related to it. There's no way of pointing to any particular example of anything anyone says and saying that this is less valid of a take on the nature of libertarianism than any other. And that's the reason, a big part of the reason why, Shane's community is the way that it is, because there isn't any sort of epistemological grounding for any of these positions. There isn't any sort of coherent reason even within Shane's arguments, other than, like a fractal referring to other concepts, but those having no methodology that can be justified, which informs them. So, referring to arguments which refer to other aspects of themselves, and it's just a giant fucking shit show.
And when you call them out on it, when you try to break apart their own internal reasoning and try to get down to actual methodology, they'll get pissed off because they'll begin to observe the absence of their own reasoning within itself, and they'll respond in the same way any politicized person would when you start to question their own, or when you start to question their own basis of their beliefs, in that they'll start to get angry, they'll start to feel attacked. And I'm pretty sure everyone here is, including in the audience, is familiar with all of these studies showing that politicized people, when exposed to information that contradicts their political worldview, will begin to experience a hormonal response as though they're being physically assaulted. And you can see that Shane and his community get into that same reflexive defensive response as though they're being attacked and immediately go on offense. In the case of Shane himself, he'll always assume bad faith on the person that he's speaking to, like their part, and immediately assume that whoever he's talking to, well, yeah, I think I said it already, is speaking in bad faith. I have a personal experience with that before I was banned from his servers, where I was talking to him directly on a topic that we're not allowed to talk about on YouTube. And when I asked him to provide a proof that an X was an X, as he was claiming it was, he instead tried to shift the burden of proof onto me to try to demonstrate some kind of statistical analysis demonstrated some claim that was only tangentially related to any claim that I was actually trying to make. And
turning into a logical positivist.
Mm-hmm. And as a result, that conversation really didn't go anywhere. But I mean, that was kind of a point where I never really followed Shane to begin with. Honestly, I kind of found him a little obnoxious, even back when I did call myself an ANCAP. Yeah, cringe, I know. But the way he framed his arguments and the fact that he never really went into depth in anything, I found to be kind of annoying. Also, the fact that he would constantly swipe at Christians for some inexplicable reason. He has this bizarre pathological obsession with just going after Christians. Like, he's never really moved on from like late 2000s, early 2010s YouTube, when it was basically just atheists versus creationists. And as a result, like, even to his content today, every time someone says something stupid that he's replying to, they're always compared to Christians or creationists. And I'm just like, why? Like, admittedly, I have bias as well because I still call myself a Christian, non-denominational Christian, but still. So I do have a bias in that regard, but regardless, you can see that there are various flaws in his reasoning and the way he approaches argumentation. That is, well, a bit spicy to say the least. And yeah, Neko, you are correct. His reflexive response to whenever he's exposed to the lack of foundation in his own internal reasoning is lie, 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 lie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's particularly ironic that he compares anyone who tries with him to establish a a methodological foundation for whatever they're talking about. It's ironic that he compares anybody who tries to do this to a fundy, a religious fundy, because first of all, that's the exact opposite of what fundamentalists do in terms of how they argue. All of their arguments either implicitly assume their particular interpretation of whatever religious text they're citing is valid to begin with, which by the way, that's another nuance to that. You can get into to begin with what even is the correct way, if there is one, to interpret scripture, and there is none. But digressing, but also if you look at how politicized people respond, like Shane, who, because he doesn't have any sort of methodology or foundation for his methodology that informs any of the concepts he's referring to, that he can point to and base his position on, that particular basis for how it emerges. Because he doesn't have this, it's actually him that's arguing like the fundamentalist. He has to do things like cite Investopedia when talking about capitalism, as though I'm supposed to care what some author on Investopedia has characterized the concept as, and as though someone just declaring what it is supposed to give me any sort of any sort of context, or what causes it to be a valid concept to begin with,
Yeah.
or a valid characterization of it.
Anyways, I think we're 20 minutes into the stream. I think we should at least start the video.
Yeah, people have definitely showed up. But yeah, let's just get into the video, because if we were to go any further, that would require us to get into things we're going to be addressing anyway.
Yeah. And I'm gonna play it in 3, 2, 1.
One of the most infuriating things about the online debate lately has just been trying to get people to accept what capitalism is. And it's been pretty much in every discussion. They're like, well, you don't know what capitalism is. Capitalism is this and that and this other thing. And I mean, you would think that those of us who are proponents of capitalism would know what we're talking about. You would hope, at least.
You would hope so, but as demonstrated by the sheer length of this video, and this is clearly not the case. And you've got to appreciate the extent to not only the fact that this video exists, but also that it continues to be used and cited by Shane specifically as a point that everyone must agree with if they want to have a discussion with Shane about the nature of capitalism at all. It just goes to show that he's trying to essentially plan the language and create some kind of platonic truth that exists outside of anyone's possible interpretation, and anyone that deviates from this truth is either misinformed or disingenuous.
Literally,
is
the very frame after the disclaimer that the video starts with, you can tell that this is just going to be squabbling over semantics.
which is
Him talking in front of some web page listing a definition. That's in this video in a nutshell, and that's the extent of his argument in a nutshell.
Well, I read books, not dictionaries.
I mean, honestly, it's a big part of the reason why I felt like talking for about a few things before we started, because there's very little to work with as far as the video is concerned. I mean, we'll be getting into some claims that he makes, but I mean, most of the problems with his argument can be traced back to a single type of, a single trope in his discourse, which is that the purpose of discourse itself is supposed to be to determine what the definition of a concept is, what the properties of it are, what justifies how it comes to be a concept, and why this is the case. I mean, I understand why this is, as sad as it is, why this kind of argumentation is so common. It's because this is how people are taught to how people are, I should say, indoctrinated to approach methodology in government schools. It's specific. That's specifically intended to destroy your ability to engage in critical thinking. You're not taught specifically what counts as critical thought, and you're not encouraged to to explore different standards of evidence and see which one pans out, um, as a better description of something than another. No, you're just told what something is, and if you provide an answer that's different from what the curriculum states is the correct answer, just because the curriculum states it, you either have points deducted or points added to your test scores, and you have to get enough points on your test score in order to continue passing through government schools, and the state will literally use violence against your family if you continue to fail.
there's just a few points I want to make, which is that language or the meaning of language and the words in a language are defined by its users. And the only way that this kind of central planning of language can function is if there was some methodology for attaining a universal meaning and context to any particular piece of information without any ability for individuals to interpret or contextualize information in a way that deviates from another person. In other words, it would only be possible if free will didn't exist, which
Well,
I'm pretty sure, whether or not he'll admit it, I think that's a position that Shane holds. I don't think he's conscious of it, but I'm pretty sure if you were to press him on it, he would eventually admit that he believes in the materialist interpretation of consciousness, which is that, the brain is just chemical reactions and nothing else can possibly emerge from that.
well, I mean that you don't even really need to follow, that particular issue with it. I mean, the most dire implication of this particular approach would be the implicit assumption that there's an intrinsic context to information just inherent to information itself. That's how information would have to work, and if that were the case, well, literally wouldn't even you wouldn't even be able to get to communication as a study. It wouldn't be possible. Communication as we understand it wouldn't need to exist. I would be able to just describe. I would be able to just convey something that everyone can universally understand, and there wouldn't be you wouldn't be able to demonstrate information problems. But getting back to the point that I was originally making, since the purpose of argumentation at all is to understand, what nature of a concept is, therefore what properties define it, and creating a methodology for determining how we figure this out. To simply cite someone else's definition in a vacuum of a concept is essentially to tell somebody else that they're wrong for even objecting, for even engaging in that line of inquiry to begin with, because it's just a thought-stopping cliche. It makes it impossible for any sort of discourse to occur, because if you're simply declaring the nature of the concept to be to be one particular understanding of it in response to somebody challenging that understanding of it, well then how do you proceed? It's not that's not refuting the other person's challenges to it. That's just negating that part, rhetorically negating the ability for that conversation to progress.
Yeah,
Do you have anything to
basically.
add, Nate? Sorry.
Oh, what I was just gonna add real quick is you can't just restrict people from using certain language. At the end of the day, it's the ideas that matter more than the words, and it's really frustrating to see the libertarian community fighting over which words to really use rather than the ideas. I mean, I have my own reasons to not use capitalism, and it's it's inconsistent, as I think we'll be pointing out in later in the video. But digressing, is there anything you would like to add, Nate?
I think the one thing that I would add is the fact that when I put out my 3 threads on capitalism, uh, probably before I became a mutualist, or at least the first 2 parts, before I became mutualist, was one of the things that I had gotten was I was told that the experts say that I'm wrong, and then and then when I point out that that's no different than saying, well, the experts say that the vaccine is safe or the lockdowns work, or we
Hold
can
on a
trust
sec. We
the.
can't talk about that on YouTube.
Damn it.
Experts say that the government isn't coercive.
The experts say that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
The experts say that Abe Lincoln was a good guy.
The experts
The
say
experts
FDR. The experts say FDR saved us from the Great Depression.
the experts also say that the sun orbits around the Earth.
The experts
Oh,
say that the sky is pink or whatever.
the experts also say that the sky consists entirely of crystal disks.
But here's a question that would absolutely blow the minds of someone who thinks that this is a valid way of understanding what counts as a concept.
Real quick,
What counts as an expert? How do you determine this?
Because they wear a suit and tie,
Because
And
other
because
experts say so.
Mhm.
It's ultimately what it will always boil down to.
Let's wrap this up though, because I want to move on to the video and I don't want to drag it out too long.
Understandable.
But I'm gonna play it. Hold on.
But so what I thought I would do is I would actually look at the definition of capitalism as it's understood by mainstream economics, because that's what you have to go with.
Talked about that.
I mean, these people are really being like the creationists. You know, when they
41 seconds.
Bruh.
You can't even go for 1 minute without being like, oh, these people are just like the creationists. It's as I said, this guy has not moved on. The creationist, who cares?
Now let me sit here and tell you what the nature of this concept is based on this scripture.
Basically, yeah. And we know that this Investopedia article is completely valid because mainstream economists say it is. What's a mainstream economist? What counts as a mainstream economist? How do we know that they're mainstream economists? Are they MMTers? Are they Keynesians? Are they Chicago? Are they Austrian? No, it's just this nebulous group of people that we believe exist called mainstream economists have all said that this article is the valid definition of capitalism, and we know it to be absolutely true because the League of Mainstream Economists, LLT, have an infallible interest in making sure that they are always correct about everything in the Platonic sense.
By the way, none of us here are even contesting contesting this particular description of capitalism. It just has entailments that Shane is not is ignoring the nuances of, and why that creates issues for the libertarian understanding of what exactly counts as freedom.
Mm-hmm. I just want to highlight my position real quick on the issue of what is capitalism. I don't care because none of my other positions or understandings rely upon people agreeing or disagreeing with me on what capitalism means. So I have no personal, intellectual, or emotional stake in this discussion. It's just that his the the extent to which Shane has put his intellectual, egotistical, and emotional investment in capitalism has, among many other things, compromised his ability to acquire knowledge and understand truth. And I find this to be actively destructive to the ends that Shane claims he seeks to bring about.
Well, ultimately, it's because when you operate inside of a political understanding of the nature of society, which Shane definitely does, as we're gonna see throughout the video. By political, by the way, I mean there's the implicit assumption that what determines norms in society are interchangeable with the norms created by political institutions or created by some sort of external influence that is ultimately dictated by some sort of organizational interest. I mean that's very much present in existing society because we have states, because political organization is still possible. But of course, there are counter economies, there are counter cultures, and they emerge organically, oftentimes clashing with what the state tries to impose onto people in accordance with its organizational interests. And something that Heretic and I openly clashed with Shane about, the fact that the state um, does have organizational interests. He's fairly explicit. And so, what that implies then is that what the state does and how it coordinates is dictated ultimately by um, what it has to do to sustain its organization model, and therefore political actors, people that maintain the state, are agents of an organization rather than what the politicized person assumes about them, which is that they're people neutral of any sort of vested interests, and everything that they act upon is going to be some sort of ideological push to influence society. Since you can see that Shane seems to frame the way that social norms emerge, and seems to ascribe and describes a lot of importance to legal frameworks, even if he doesn't identify himself as someone who is approaching society from a political perspective. He definitely does.
Yeah.
And what were you gonna say?
I was gonna like, I thought you were done. I apologize. I was just gonna like say like well let's continue with the point.
Yeah, because this would actually be a great time to continue, because he's about to say would perfectly segue into some of the issues that emerge when you think this way, when you become emotionally invested in what you're claiming to be true, specifically because you have a political view of society.
They talk about the
Why
theory
that
of
was relevant.
Uh,
Sorry,
uh,
go ahead.
yeah, sorry about that.
evolution,
Fine.
and they say, well, see, evolution is just a theory. It's not proven, because the popular definition of theory is an idea that hasn't been proven, it hasn't been tested, it somehow becomes a fact later on. That's not how science uses the term theory. That's a hypothesis in science. In science, a theory is a model that incorporates facts and math and data and laws, and helps you model a part of the universe and make testable predictions about it. Theory is as high as it gets in science. And if you understand science, then you know that. But if you're not, and you're not using the scientific definition of theory, then you cannot hope to have a good debate on it. Well, it's the same thing here. It's the same thing here. If we're going
uh this is ironic. I just wanted to point that out because like basically he's relying on a totally subjective thing, like a subjective like word, basically, that anybody can interpret themselves as meaning whatever they want it to mean.
One thing I can't help but enjoy is the emphasis that he places on trying to approach uh, topics in economics and social organization, which, no matter what understanding of capitalism you have, there's everyone from an anarcho-capitalist to a Marxist to a socialist to whatever theory you describe yourself to, all going to agree that it's related to some understand or to some topic on social organization in some context. But so with this understanding, we can see that basically everyone agrees that it's related to what I could characterize as the social sciences. And from this understanding, I would then relate this to what Mises characterized under methodological dualism, where you can't apply the methodologies used in the natural sciences to the social sciences, in the sense that because free will exists, this necessarily entails that you can't model or make mathematical predictions about how people will organize, about how people will behave, about what preferences they may hold in the next 5 minutes, about what knowledge they may or may not obtain in the future. No matter how complex your mathematical equations, or even how sophisticated and the amount of processing power a computer will have, because they would essentially have to be able to model what context people will have in the future, which is, as I'm pretty sure you can imagine, impossible to predict for an individual, let alone for millions and even billions of individuals. And yet he seems perfect. I don't know if he's just completely unaware of methodological dualism or just outright rejects it. I'm going to, for the sake of being charitable, assume that he doesn't know about it. But it's very interesting that he tries to apply. What he's described there was the natural sciences in regards to evolution, and trying to apply that exact same methodology to what is pretty uncontroversially a social scientific topic. And I don't know if he's unaware of it, or I don't know if he's aware of it or not. I'm willing to be charitable on that, but he's clearly making a categorical error, and I think it's well worth highlighting. And this is why I said like earlier that I genuinely do not believe that, even if Shane himself is unaware of it, I do not believe that Shane believes in free will. I think that is in his mind, it's just a series of chemical reactions with which no emergent property could exist whatsoever. I think he's a methodological materialist, honestly.
And in social studies, as the praxeologue, as a methodological dualist, as a libertarian would understand it, um, the what counts as something that can be observed emerges directly out of actions that have already taken place. And the fact, and you can actually tell that Shane doesn't at least grasp the implications of this, because he constantly, when people present what about isms to him, what happens if this, and this, he still operates very much around the. He operates very much around the internal reasoning that his claims about ethics need to have some sort of moral prescription, because he self-describes as a deontologist, which, if you are a deontologist, you by default are not consistent about your methodology in the social studies if you're also claiming to be a libertarian and an Austrian. Because if you are consistent, and you would only be able to describe ethics from the virtue ethicist perspective if you're claiming dualism to be valid. In other words, the actions taken determine what counts as a claim, not what claims could possibly exist, and I need to create principles around I need to just declare principles and then determine whether or not these principles are valid based on actions that people could possibly take. Because you run into the exact same issue. You don't whether or not an action counts as a claim, um, is specifically dependent on the nature of the actions taken. This is why ANCAPs run into issues like the donut problem.
Yeah. Uh, Basically, Omen is right, though. We should show more of Shane's video.
All right.
Basically, I think.
I didn't really need to go on much more about the point that I was making.
Yeah. Uh, Basically, I think he's gonna. I think if we like listen for a little bit longer, we can actually get a little more in, and yeah, shorten this out. At least that's what I'm gonna try, because you know. But anyway, I'm gonna play the video now.
going to talk about capitalism, we need to talk about it as economists understand it to be. So that's what I'm doing
economists?
here. This is Investopedia.
Like, what do you mean by economists? But like,
Which economists? Like, are we talking about like really ancient economists, like from the medieval era, who didn't even have a theory theory of value, or are we talking about like modern monetary theorists, quote unquote economists?
yeah,
Which individual economists are we referring to? Because you're talking about economists as a category, and I would think Shane would be aware enough to know that, hey, there's a lot of disagreement between economists.
Yeah, this isn't, the Mises Institute or, Tom Woods or someone going, well, that's an Austrian economist and they're wacky. Okay, fair enough. Mainstream economics source here about the definition of capitalism and what it is. So
I don't care about your mainstream economics.
we'll start
it's
right off the bat.
Pause real quick. When I was watching this with Gavi, like I think a week and a half ago, before I watched a video, I was actually considering making a video about it, and then I actually watched the video and I realized, hey, I can actually just debunk the video just by doing the following. Oh hi, I'm the Heretic, and today we're going to debunk Shane Killian's video, What is Capitalism, that he posted on July 24th, 2020. He cites an Investopedia article at no point throughout its entire 26-minute, 30-second video explaining why it's valid. Questions? Comments? Critique? That's basically the whole video.
Okay, and let's just take this at face. Let's just take what's being described here at face value. Do you want to let him talk about it for a bit, or should we just
we could like
as I mentioned, as I mentioned at the start, I'm not a heretic, and I at least are not interested in arguing semantics or the history of the social connotations that the concept used to have. We're describing the exact same thing here, Shane. I can point out issues that the concept has, at least if we're going to try to treat it as though it has any sort of relationship with free markets. Okay, well, while the state exists, because the state has a monopoly on the way that resources are distributed through planning interest rates, and planning how new supply is distributed into different parts of the area that the state is claiming, its political economy. Well, that's just how it's able to, how it's able to leverage these norms over people. Also, it ultimately determines what counts as quote unquote private property, and it ultimately determines what counts as an investment. If you do invest resources, and the state doesn't like what resources are invested, or doesn't like how much was invested, or disagrees with who you invested uh, in order to even participate in its political economy, you need to be a legally recognized actor in its political economy. And whether or not it legally recognizes you is entirely arbitrary and determined by its interests. But even if you don't want to get into that, it can simply say whether or not your claim counts as a claim or not. So even if let's get into what counts. So when we're talking about capitalism, when we're talking about a political economy, Sure, people who aren't directly tied to political institutions and invest their own capital, but ultimately what they can invest in or who can invest in what is going to be determined by the state. Specifically, if the state doesn't like what you're investing in or doesn't like what you're producing, the FTC can simply say it's not can simply say that it's not a valid transaction. And even if you were to ignore the FTC, there would the fact that there is a specific institution that the state set up in order to directly manage that aspect of the political economy. The state would be able to do this anyway because in existing, it needs to possess in order for its organization model to sustain itself, it needs to create a political economy, and therefore it needs to have needs to have the ability to act in the way that I previously described. So yeah, people are using what the state recognizes as their resources and are engaging in transactions the state recognizes as private transactions. But ultimately, their ability to do so, the entire reason that they have for doing so, the incentives around them that were created by political planning that made it so those particular resources count as a standard of profit and count as something that needs to be traded with the other actors in the political economy. Um, because of this, yeah, state isn't directly coordinating the resources, but ultimately, this is just political planning with the capital being managed by third parties. And well, I'm sorry, because Nate told me that we shouldn't give long responses. Well, there's a lot to go over here, so I apologize. But if we are looking at what counts as quote unquote private property, from the perspective of capitalism, again, whether or not you're claiming a resource is ultimately determined by the state, because the state can simply, even if you're acting upon a resource and you haven't infringed upon anyone else's claim in the act of making that claim, or you're acting upon resources but the state doesn't consider them to be resources, that the state can simply say that's not a claim, or can simply object to that, and it can simply take that from you. Or the state could characterize something which is which is state backed, as a privately owned resource, or it can just invent resources which don't actually exist. And actually, the concept itself entails, in order to actually, act in defending them, aggressing upon other people, so they're not claims, let alone resources, like IP or corporate law being two primary examples of this. Yeah, the state can consider that private property, and ultimately whether or not the claim is allowed to exist is entirely determined by the state. The problem fundamentally with capitalism, or with any sort of political economy, is that what counts as a standard of what counts as a claim has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not people are actually acting upon resources or the content of their action. And while a political economy exists, that can never be the case, because the specific purpose of a political economy is to allow a third party organization, is to make it so a third party organization plans this.
All right, let's
Uh,
keep going.
that pretty much early on you're going to see that the socialists and other statists have the definition all wrong, and we've been using it correctly the whole time. So it says, what is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own capital goods. The production of goods and services is based on supply and demand in the general market, known as a market economy, rather than through central planning, known as a planned economy or command economy. The purest form of capitalism is free market or laissez-faire capitalism. Here, private individuals are unrestrained. They may determine where to invest, what to produce or sell, and at which prices to exchange goods and services. The laissez-faire marketplace operates without checks or controls. That's not strictly true. It operates without forceful checks or controls like from government, but you can...
I kind of question why Shane would even cite this definition if he's going to make contention, or if he's going to contest some of the language that they use anyway. I mean, this whole video is just a giant semantics argument, but it still kind of begs the question, why do you even care for people to watch this video and use it as a citation for your own terminology and demand that in order to even get the privilege of being able to discuss information with you, that they must watch this video?
Yeah, why are you allowed to question the experts? Because that's, you're citing this as the experts and their description of capitalism, and that justifies the notion that capitalism is compatible with the libertarian understanding of markets. At the same time, you're contesting parts of the description. Why? What's that based upon? What experts said there's problems with that?
Well, I just want to I just want to point out below that, and I don't know, I kind of forget if he covers the part below, but it says, today most countries practice mixed capitalist systems that include some degree of government regulation, which is my exact problem as to why I don't use capitalism. It's a political economy.
And there's by the way, just so Shane or someone who is one of Shane's one of Shane's followers for some reason still follows Shane, why they can't come along and poison the argument by saying that's corporatism. No, I'm not. I'm not pointing to something that the state recognizes, that the state claims is being, is a government-backed institution. I'm saying that there functionally isn't a difference between, isn't a difference that you can point to while a political economy exists within the context of that political economy between, quote-unquote private actor and a political institution. Because quote-unquote private actors within the white market, within the political economy, can only make claims if those claims are recognized by the state, and can only associate and trade with resources with other actors that the state recognizes, and because the state recognizes them, this is why the only reason that transaction's allowed to happen. Essentially, the only difference between a capitalist political economy and any other political economy is that the capital invested in production processes are being provided by by the serfs in that political economy, by people who are producing resources that are not that are not produced directly by government agencies, by resources invested by the government, but the government invests colossal amounts of resources in controlling how those are how those resources are distributed, interest rates, etc. So as to effectively control what people can and can't use for trade.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna play the video.
So, for example, what if if we're talking about InQtel, that venture capital firm that was started by the CIA that's legally recognized as a private organization, but all of its resources are funneled into it by the CIA, and it exists for the sole purpose of providing capital to firms that the government has an interest in propping up, mainly communication, mainly related to the communication infrastructure. So Google being the main firm that it invests money into. Is that something, if we're going to treat capitalism as though it's interchangeable with the notion of a market, as libertarians would understand it, is that a state run, is that actually a private organization? If so, what's the basis for distinguishing it from other private organizations, even though it's clearly not a private even though it's clearly not an organization that's disconnected from state management? It's literally run by the CIA.
Anyway, should we keep going?
Yeah.
You can still have UL, the IETF, things like that. As long as it's all implemented voluntary, you can have that in capitalism.
Real quickly, I don't want to just keep on pausing, but just notice his phrasing and how he says things like that are okay and things can be implemented quote unquote voluntarily.
He pretty explicitly is seeing his end as some sort of political economy.
Mm-hmm.
He's just
We've already established how this is the case.
I think it's worth pointing out just to the sorry. I think it was worth pointing out to the audience. Not all of them will be aware of this, but you'll see throughout the entire video, Shane is going to be using things like you're allowed to do X under capitalism, or you have permission to do things voluntarily, implying the existence of some third-party central authority that is dictating all of these terms, which very clearly demonstrates that even if he's doing so unwittingly, because Shane's a thin boy, he's going to be approaching this from the perspective that there's still some third-party arbitrary framework, which is totally not a state, you guys.
Yeah, and that specifically is going to necessitate him arguing within a political framework, because what he's seeing as these ends are the result of some sort of manufactured property norms or political planning that creates the conditions for a libertarian end to exist. And of course, this is directly in conflict with how libertarians understand ethics, as noted earlier. The product of the action determining whether or not something counts as a claim. If a state exists and a political economy exists, this by default means that people can't make claims. Because the state simply, whether or not someone is able to defend a claim is not dependent on their action, it's dependent on whether or not the state allows it to exist, hence the libertarian case for eliminating the state. Why the state is inherently illegitimate.
Alright. I'm gonna... yeah.
Today, most countries provide a mixed capitalist system that includes some degree of government regulation of business and ownership of select industries. So getting into this, Functionally speaking, capitalism is one process by which the problems of economic production and resource distribution might be resolved. Instead of planning economic decisions through centralized political methods such as socialism or feudalism, and we'll talk about this, they keep saying, oh, capitalism is just feudalism. No, it isn't. It's the opposite. Economic planning under capitalism occurs via decentralized and voluntary decisions, and
they're ultimately not voluntary. If the state forces them upon you, and the state does so by coercing a whole bunch of other people in order to manufacture these conditions as artificial property norms.
This is I think the main difference between thin libertarians and thick libertarians. Thin boys like Shane approach libertarianism from the perspective that, oh, it's just a competing legal theory to that of the state. All you need to do is just make the state illegal, and then everything will be great and wonderful and perfect.
Yeah, and basically to address the point, just because you have a choice doesn't mean it's voluntary. Economic entrapment isn't voluntary. Landlords aren't voluntary. I'm tired of having to say that, because there is no instance where you're gonna agree to a landlord unless something like an Airbnb. That's the closest thing.
It's because the actual problem with that is because it depends entirely on. This is another can of worms, but that depends entirely on land being defined by fiat, and how that is distinct from land claims being established as a result of action is specifically because third party organizations, specifically zoning planners or banks before boards specifically dedicated to zoning, whose titles would be backed by the threat of the state, need to be enforced in order to create a market for housing in the sense that it exists in modernity, specifically to eliminate the risk that would otherwise be associated with investing in any sort of contractual claims related to either claiming rent or trading homes in the sense that we see today, where it's not just something that exists in a local economy, but firms like BlackRock can own every single house in a given country, and they can do so because it's possible in accordance with their organization model, because there's an administered price on what counts as property value, whereas because claims would be different in any given area, it wouldn't be possible to establish an administered price on houses. Therefore, it wouldn't be possible to establish administered prices on rent in a way that it would allow you to create like a landlord framework that exists today.
If I may, I'd like to mention something that Mikhail Bakunin wrote in his critique on capitalism, because I think it highlights the point that we're trying to make. If that's all right, real quick.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So here's what he had to say in his 1877 essay, which I linked in my second thread. In this small section, he says, quote, "I shall therefore confine myself here to the statement that property owners and capitalists, inasmuch as they live not by their own productive labor, but by getting land rent, house rent, interest upon their capital, or by speculation on land, buildings, and capital, by the commercial and the industrial exploitation of the manual labor of the proletariat, all live at the expense of the proletariat. Speculation and exploitation, no doubt, also constitute a sort of labor, but altogether non-productive labor. I, I know only too well that this mode of life is highly esteemed in all civilized countries, that is, that it is expressly and tenderly protected by all the states, and that the states, religions, and all the judicial laws of tongue twister here. Sorry. Both criminal and civil, and all the political governments, monarchies, and republican, with their immense judicial and police apparatuses and their standing armies, have no other mission but to consecrate and protect such practices. In the presence of these powerful and respectable authorities, I cannot even permit myself to ask whether this mode of life is legitimate from the point of view of human justice, liberty, human equality, and fraternity. I simply ask myself, under such conditions, are fraternity and equality possible between the exploiter and the exploited? Are justice and freedom possible for the exploited? That's all I wanted to read, just for context.
And I guess just... And there's nothing really objectionable about that when you understand some of the, the problems that we were bringing up with trying to associate the legal concept of property with property as as the end of a claim being made, which he clearly was trying to articulate, as he'd clearly explained in other essays. His work being inspired by the methodology of Proudhon. Teal Deer, why wouldn't a claim like a rent contract be possible in the absence of political planning? Because the risk that would be associated with the investment in the absence of administered prices would make it so there would be no way to sustain any sort of profitable arrangement around doing so, as a modern Austro-libertarian would understand.
And I should
in terms that would make it easy for an Austrian to understand.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say real quick, the word that that my tongue got twisted on was juridical. Juridical. That's how to say it. But anyways, that's all.
Yeah, I was just going to remark on some of the questions that Kit's been asking me in chat. First off, how many times have I been on a gay cruise? 0. And how many times have Eso and I done quote unquote the dirty? Also 0. And that's pretty much it.
Well, I'm gonna play it.
Skip over the bullet points because they're just a summary of what we're about to cover anyway. And I think one problem is a lot of people just kind of look at the summary and they grab it and they run off with it. And then they kind of fill in the details with their own imagination. Of course, you don't get those details in a summary. And so they imagine those details to be one thing when they're really another. And you try to press them on it and it doesn't work and you're talking to a wall. So we're talking about capitalism and private property. Private property rights are fundamental to capitalism. And it goes into John Locke and homesteading and things we've covered before.
Is there anything you guys want to add to that? Because
not really.
Literally making it explicitly clear he bases his understanding of what informs these concepts on Lockean liberalism, not libertarianism.
Yeah,
it might be worth it to go into the problem with the Lockean homesteading principle.
Sure, because a good chunk of the philosophical libertarian circles literally do not understand the difference between liberalism and libertarianism. I mean, if you would like to go into that specifically, go ahead. I think distinguishing how libertarians look at ethics and therefore claims contrasted with the political perspective already highlights the main difference between the two schools of thought.
Well, yeah, and it operates under legal contract theory, and that's not libertarianism. I'm sorry to say. You can and like as you guys said earlier, the problem with thin boys is the fact that they want to go about it in the they want to go about like getting rid of the state or minimizing the state in like through political means. And like literally, I'm pretty sure Shane Killian sees nothing wrong with a state if you really look at it at the end of the day.
Fundamentally, he is a legal positivist, and you'll see a lot of legal positivist takes just as we go further into the video. I pointed out before that his language is very specifically built around you're under capitalism, you're allowed to do things, you're permitted, and you can just it's just as a question. If you're actually like understanding how society emerges and what causes certain organizational models to emerge, and I'm not just referring to the state, I'm referring to like any organizational model that actually can emerge, then no one's actually in a position to allow or permit or license anyone to do anything. It just, happens because people want it to happen.
Yeah, that's why I said that anarcho-capitalists are just legalists, at least when you talk to the thin boys.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they just want to have their defense rights organizations and pretend that they're not a third party monopoly on arbitration. And it's definitely not a state, you guys. I promise. You know this because we call it something completely different. Oh, and by the way, would you like to join my country, the United States Covenant Community? It's basically the United States federal government.
United States of Disney.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Remember that hop-in that you were sharing around your server a week or two ago, who in response to I don't know what their position was, but they said the closest thing that will ever exist to an ANCAP society is Disneyland, which LOL.
Disney World.
Disney World.
Yeah.
And their response was, actually, Disney had this idea for a private society that was based, so not even objecting, just like, yeah.
Yeah.
And you could pretty see like there are some Shane Killian's fans that actually see nothing wrong with corporations.
Well, I don't think that really matters. I will just say this right now. I would rather live in one of the lower circles of Dante's hell than a covenant community run by Disney. And if anyone tries to even establish that kind of organization model, I will actively work to subvert it.
Well, I'm gonna play more of it now.
Let's go.
Orbit. It says, for individuals or businesses to deploy their capital goods confidently, a system must exist that protects their legal right to own or transfer property. Contracts, fair dealing, tort law, things like that. When property is not privately owned but shared by the public, a problem known as the tragedy of the commons can emerge. With a common pool resource which all people can use and none can limit access to, all individuals have an incentive to extract as much use value as they can and no incentive to conserve or reinvest in the future. Privatizing the resource is one possible solution to this problem, along with various voluntary or involuntary collective action approaches.
So, is he implying that, it's like it's unethical to have a collective, even if you try to even if you agree and like actually mutually uh you know relate to each other, or have a mutual relationship with each other. Sorry about that.
It's just that Shane doesn't can't conceive of any other methods of of solving the problem of the tragedy of the commons other than through private property, which even in modernity, insofar as that is heavily controlled and coerced by what's it called, by state fiat claims, you still have at least in the United States, one pretty good example of the tragedy of the commons being solved completely voluntarily by people just acting on that resource in such a way that serves their mutual benefit. In various rural places, particularly in the Northeast, there is a very strong hunting culture where, yeah, it's like state and federal land, but if you have a hunting license, you can basically just go about those woods as you see fit, so long as you're not causing significant disruptions, like detonating nuclear bombs or something ridiculous like that. And hunters aren't going out of their way to like depopulate the deer entirely. They just go there, get what they want, and leave. And you actually talk to those hunters, or to see like other people talk to the hunters, and you see like they're the biggest environmentalists. They're the biggest conservationists, because for them it's a hobby and they enjoy doing it, and they want to keep enjoy doing it, and so they have an incentive to not only be mindful about causing as little damage to the environment as they possibly can, but also to ensure that people that they hang out with are also doing the same. So you have a social dynamic that is actively working to solve the tragedy of the commons without any actual delegate or demarcation of private property. You have essentially a common situation that has basically solved itself. Rather, a solution has emerged.
Well, and just what I was going to point out is even in modernity, if you look at areas where potholes in roads are a particularly bad issue, people attempt to, in local networks, just get gravel together and fill the potholes and pave over them, but or where there needs to be a ramp or some set of stairs in a park or some other place that is quote unquote state owned property, which isn't actually a thing because the state isn't legitimate to begin with, so it can't have property. But digressing, um, people try to build stairs or other structures on these these plots of land. The problem? Well, anyone caught doing that gets fined or arrested by the state because they are acting upon a claim in a way that the state doesn't consider legitimate. Um, more specifically, they're they're disrupting the way that the supply of resources would otherwise be distributed, because in order legally, in order for those structures to be built, it would have supply shifted around differently, and consequently that makes it so no one really wants to do this on with resources that everyone acts upon and therefore has an interest in building these things for. Which, by the way, this is only a problem again if you're looking at the types of economies and the types of economies that emerge as being ultimately what determine social norms, and those being a consequence of political planning. because in that sense, you can't even take into consideration the existence of a commons, which is the problem here. Shane is conflating commons with something that the state is claiming, whereas in the absence of a state, resources can become a commons because in order to exclusively claim them because of the claims that emerged, it would entail acting using active force against someone else's existing claims and would therefore be an act of aggression, but specifically because it's being acted upon by multiple parties have a mutual interest in maintaining it. So the tragedy of the commons is not a real thing.
Yeah. Basically, I guess to continue, you do not need like a top-down way of owning things to keep society keep things protected. Like basically, if if people like mutually benefit from you know like you were pointing out earlier, like the roads, people will go out and fill those roads. It's not a real problem. And like I find it funny that ANCAPs are using the same logic that statists use, because if you make something public, then chaos will happen.
It means that a state must own it. It's ultimately how they think of it.
Yeah.
If it's not ascribed to a private owner, then that means a state has to exist.
But
Because they don't understand the libertarian framework for ethics.
yeah.
I
But
think I think that part of it is that they don't realize that they're falling for the Lockean view of property.
Well, yeah, a lot of ANCAP like property norms are flawed, and like I said, it operates under legalism, and that's why I say that most of the time ANCAPs are not really anarchists, and if the ANCAP is anarchist, then they don't know the terms they're using. They're just they're just like watching videos like these and say, well, I agree with voluntary transactions, and then they lead to a false conclusion.
Yeah.
But I guess I'll continue more of the video.
Yeah, sure.
Really, the capitalism is the only solution that's actually been shown to work. Lots of people have proposed others, but anyway, we're talking about capitalism, profits, and losses. That next part is important, the and losses, because people are always like, well, capitalism is just about profit. No, it's about loss as well. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand capitalism.
Can we pause here?
So it says profits are...
I just found when me and Gavi were talking about this, I brought up this point earlier, but since Nate's here, I think it's fair to bring up the question again. So I'll repeat myself. Eso.
Yeah.
At any point when you've been discussing the concept of capitalism with anyone ever, has the topic of profits and losses been relevant to your definition?
Oh, I'd say
Gavi.
it has been.
Yeah, no,
Gavi, has profits and losses been relevant to how you conceptualize capitalism?
No, I always seen profits as and losses as arguing from efficiency, and I never argue from efficiency, because just because something's efficient doesn't mean it's ethical.
Now, Nate, same question.
Yeah. No, I have never. That has never been brought up.
Yeah.
Oh.
So we're trying to question the conceptual validity of capitalism, and certainly, if we want to talk about profits and losses, we can talk about profits and losses. But profits and losses exist independent of whatever economic system your legal arbitrator wishes to impose upon you at this particular point, or not at all. So the only reason that this is brought up at all is because it happens to be in this Investopedia article.
Yeah.
Oh, and what I was going to add is the fact that you're even going to cite economic concepts such as efficiency or something needing to exist because it meets this particular norm. That itself, that is more revealing than a lot of people tend to consider, because that itself, hints at what's being described here, being a completely manufactured fiat property norm or a consequence of political planning. And as a consequence of that, the argument being made is explicitly defending something that would entail coercion to exist, because within the internal reasoning it somehow leads to their particular end, how they see property emerging, which itself logically means that how they characterize property is not compatible with a free society. But also it means that their position has nothing to do fundamentally with the nature of the claims themselves, and therefore that naturally raises into question, well, what counts then as a claim if these completely tangentially related topics, but don't really entail what counts as a claim either way, or have any relevance to what counts as a claim to emerge. Tangentially related because because economics is a social study in the way that ethics, as libertarians understand it, would be.
Yeah. Well,
Since you're studying the nature of action and what entailed steps in actions cause certain things to emerge, and the nature of what counts as a claim, consequently you would need to be using the same methodology Austrians use when studying economics. Otherwise, there's an inconsistency in how you characterize concepts.
yeah.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Closely associated with private property, by definition, an individual only enters into a voluntary exchange of private property when they believe the exchange benefits them in some psychic or material way. In such trades, each party gains extra subjective value or profit from the transaction, just as we've been saying the whole time. Voluntary trade.
This is the other point that I was going to get around to, which is because political economies and capitalism require the state to determine ultimately what counts as a standard of profit by creating administered price schemes and creating a bunch of artificial claims to manufacture economic incentives. If someone is engaging in economic action within a white market or within political institutions, what they count profit to be is going to be skewed by the state existing. So it ultimately isn't going to be determined by them in an interest-free environment. It's determined by institutions around them creating all of these fixed costs, and therefore nudging them in the direction of associating with in certain types of firms, or in being in certain positions of leverage relative to other economic actors, and the entire, every organization in those particular frameworks then are called into question, particularly the ones that require these artificial norms to exist to begin with, like centralized proprietary firms, for example. What
Yeah.
The reason why I bring this up is because what counts as efficiency then, within this particular framework, is going to be entailed by what counts as a norm manufactured by the state, what norms the state manufactures, since those directly influence what people can, how people inform their own relative standards of profit. So you're, again, not really talking about a free market here. You're just talking about economic planning with extra steps.
Well, anyway, we're over like 2 hours here, so I'm
Okay.
I'm gonna like let Shane Killian talk longer, and if he makes multiple points, we'll just address those multiple points. But like, let's
That's
keep it as
fine.
brief.
That's fine. I'll mute. And plus, I kind of needed to go to the bathroom anyway, so I'll be right back.
Well, I'm gonna continue. Are you guys ready and stuff?
Yes.
Is the mechanism that drives activity in a capitalist system. What have we been saying? We've been saying exactly that. And the statists and socialists are going, no, that's not how it is. Well, here we are. Mainstream economists saying that's how it is.
That makes me laugh.
The owners of resources compete with one another over consumers, who in turn compete with other consumers over goods and services. All this activity is built into the price system, which balances supply and demand to coordinate the distribution of resources. A capitalist earns the highest profit by using capital goods most efficiently while producing the highest value good or service. In this system, information about what is highest valued is transmitted through those prices at which another individual voluntarily purchases the capitalist goods or services. And I think it's a really important point that price is a form of communication between producers and consumers. It's really the best form of communication we have between them. By producers expressing a price as being a value of something and consumers expressing their opinion in their decision to buy or not to buy, you've got a crucial back and forth, which means that prices really are a form of speech, and therefore any price controls should be seen as a First Amendment violation.
That just goes to show you he's arguing from the a constitutionalist standpoint, which like libertarians don't do. And secondly, prices are manually like I guess artificially manufactured all the time. We see this with corporations creating artificial competition and fake supply and demand links.
Well, the idea is that while prices are arbitrary, if a firm values a higher revenue and even attempting to make a profit, or a financial profit, I should say, they will inform how they decide with their prices on the basis of how they can maximize their revenue. That's not always going to be the case, of course, and there's plenty of room for miscalculation because, as Ludwig Lockman points out, any kind of equilibrium, or the equilibrium in a supply and demand curve, is never static. And even if you can correctly calculate it, that calculation is only useful at that particular instance in time, and by the time you've already observed it, it's already changed, because people's preferences and decisions are constantly changing. Now, what makes this also interesting is, crap, I actually forgot where I was going with this.
I just got back, so I couldn't help you.
It's all right. Anyways, just going.
Yeah, just for reference, he's talking about supply and demand.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean,
well, this gets back to just one thing I was going to add is this gets again into what I was just saying a moment ago, because what counts as profit is influenced greatly by the state planning how supply is distributed or how people can invest resources. And what counts as a resource that can be invested. This consequently means that the supply and demand that exists in the white market, I've been referring to them as administered prices because that's ultimately what they are, but that's planned specifically by the state, and therefore it doesn't actually reflect the economic action taken by people. Um, and as Heretic was talking about in relation to Ludwig Lockman's observations about supply and demand, since supply and demand are both determined by people engaging in action with their own resources. They're not something that could be planned out in the way that general supply and demand theory would need it to be in order to be coherent, because first of all, what resources are being acted upon and how they're being acted upon is different depending on the person, and is being influenced in real time by things that aren't possible to calculate themselves. But also, how a person is, it's not, but because of that, it's not really possible for someone to act upon a supply demand chart in order to calculate their resources, in order to get an idea of what counts as the supply and demand of that given market. Because what counts as a market is not really possible to create a sort of universal standard for. Is constantly changing depending on human action, and what even counts as one's understanding of what the supply in those markets are is going to be relative to that particular person.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah.
How do you get out of that? How do you get out of that? So profits are an indication that less valuable inputs have been transformed into more valuable outputs. By contrast, the capitalist suffers losses when capital resources are not used efficiently and instead used to create less valuable outputs. And so then they go into the concepts of free enterprise or capitalism. I won't read this whole thing, but basically you have free enterprise, which is, it says they're often seen as synonymous, but they're actually kind of distinct. An economy is capitalist as long as private individuals control the factors of production. However, a capitalist system can still be regulated by laws and taxed. Free enterprise.
Yeah. Did you just see that? Or hear that, I should say?
I think I missed it. Could you explain?
Here, I'll just rewind it.
As long as private individuals control the factors of production. However, a capitalist system can still be regulated by laws and taxed. Free enterprise.
Did you see how he just skimmed over that and looked uncomfortable there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Possible to have a free market without capitalism.
Oh no. It's almost like this. It's almost like the article that he's put basically all of his faith into suddenly proved our point. Whoops.
Well, more specifically, that we're not making a semantic argument. Just that there are epistemological problems with trying to treat these concepts as interchangeable.
Yeah. But anyways, I'm gonna continue it, and hopefully he talks about how it talks more about quote unquote capitalist governments.
Can roughly be understood to mean economic exchanges free of coercive government influence. Although unlikely, it is possible to conceive of a system where individuals choose to hold all property rights in common. This is also what we've been saying. And we've been asking the question of which system will allow the other. Well, if we have a capitalist system and you're a communist and you want to set up your own communal system inside of that capitalist system, go for it. As long as you're not forcing anyone else to participate, that's fine. But it won't go the other way around. If we have a communist or a socialist system, they will not tolerate any little capitalist enclaves that try to form in the middle.
You want to know why? You want to know why? Because they reject political organization explicitly. Even Kropotkin talks about how we should move away from political organization in the conquest of bread.
Well, actual and comms. He just said communists, and if we're talking about Marxists, that's not the case. But
true. I'm just saying that we're not talking about building a system in another system.
Yeah, so as far as like what at least Kropotkin was referring to, setting up, squatting a building, so homesteading it, filling it with a bunch of 3D printers and plants, and as well as farming animals to allow people to get food without engaging in a political economy, and using that particular location as a commons and networking through it in local local economy with the other people maintaining it. Who's being coerced there? Because that's actually what the at least like that's what the actual ANCOM position is, as an actual anarchist philosophy and not a Marxist subversion of it.
I mean, I've said this in my opening statement in the capitalism special on my show, that I've come to realize that anarchism isn't just about one system and one system only. It's about different ideas and voluntarily creating their own organizational models. They're not trying to do it within each other.
You're not you can't even have political economies, because political economies require the organization model that states need to exist to be present. And anarchy is a condition that's achieved specifically when that's been eliminated and when people can make claims.
Right.
So how people economize beyond that point is entirely, their business, so long as they're not aggressing upon anyone else.
Well,
right.
Yeah, I'm gonna continue it though, if you guys are ready.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah.
And they use a lot of American tribes as elements of having these arrangements. So, all right, so let's talk about feudalism. We're told over and over and over that capitalism is feudalism, and it says capitalism grew out of European feudalism. And so, well, there you go, that means it's feudalism. No. Mushrooms grow out of wet dirt, but mushrooms are not wet dirt. Okay, it's a different thing.
Bad analogy.
So up until the 12th century, less than 5% of the population of Europe lived in towns.
I mean, there
Skilled
are still
workers
functions of a feudal political economy that are present in modern political economies. For example, corporate law just being a reformation of the guild system.
You also have agency shop, where if you're in certain trades in certain states, it's illegal to work in your trade unless you're part of a union, which is identical to sumptuary laws from the medieval times, where if you worked a certain trade, it was illegal to work unless you were part of a guild.
And we're getting to the juicy part, because if you read below that, mercantilism replaces feudalism, implying that mercantilism, this article's admitting that mercantilism or capitalism came out of mercantilism.
My point, though, is that this point isn't necessarily it isn't inaccurate, it's really more that what is the political economy that we're referring to here, the type of political economy, capitalism, exists because it was no longer, specifically because it was no longer possible for states to maintain the feudal mercantile model. That model was entirely dependent upon the assumption that there was unclaimed land that the state in question would still be able to claim and consequently colonize all of the resources
Hmm.
from.
Well, I'm gonna play more of this.
The city, but received their keep from feudal lords rather than a real wage, and most workers were serfs for landed nobles. However, by the late Middle Ages, rising urbanism with cities as centers of industry and trade became more and more economically important.
Thanks
the advent
for
of
bringing
true
that up,
wages
actually,
offered by
because yeah, he starts because this article and consequently, his points reference the Industrial Revolution. Were you aware that the original models for the technologies that were central to the Industrial Revolution were originally designed to be significant, able to function on a significantly smaller, less capital intense scale than was incentivized by the new capitalist political economies at the time.
Hmm.
The steam engine, the original design for the steam engine, literally could have fit on a table.
Yeah. Like.
And the reason why the reason specifically why large scale factories began even being able to function, but let alone people were incentivized in the early part of that political economy to associate with them, is because of the enclosure movement and the state redefining its fiat on land. And also the state constructing these political economies that controlled the way that people associated with their own resources more intensively. Whereas previously this was still the case, but every single what the state defined as a town had its own political economy and had its own had its own prop had its own like property norms that were defined by the state.
Yeah. Well, let's continue.
by the trades encouraged more people to move into towns where they could get money rather than subsistence in exchange for labor. Families' extra sons and daughters who needed to be put to work could find new sources of income in the trade towns. Child labor was as much a part of the town's economic development as serfdom was the part of rural life. And again, I would remind you, let's not pretend that the child labor just sprang into existence during the Industrial Revolution. And before then, children were just merrily skipping through fields all day. No. They were working. They were just working on the farm. They moved to the towns because they were getting a better deal than they were on the farms. That's what people need to remember.
Literally, no. The reason so many people were forced into urban centers is because the state started assigning existing property claims to different parties because it started defining property claims differently. Because it started, like, for example, if if a particular farm, like, because of the way that land titles are defined in a political economy where there's a certain grid of land that is assigned to a certain legal entity, state started moving those lines, like the lines of those grids around, and ascribing them to corporate entities. So literally, no. The reason the vast majority of people began moving to cities was because they were effectively forced to by the state.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why that was necessary for the state to do this, of course, was to manufacture an incentive for people to associate with these centralized models of production, which was necessary in order to create consistent tax schemes
And I
around,
think
and in order to make it so the trends that these new technologies central to the industrial revolution developed around weren't actually subversive to political organization itself. Because if every single person could have a steam engine in their kitchen like the way they were originally designed, oh yeah, that would have created some serious issues with trying to control the way people invested capital or the way people managed their resources.
the way I see it, like wasn't this around the time that the enclosure movement began, where the state would just straight up kick people off of land that they've lived on for generations, and
Yeah,
basically
that's what
force
I'm
them into,
referring
force,
to.
yeah, that's what I thought. And well, yeah, people weren't going there because it was a better deal. Sure, this would be around the time when more people were becoming tradesmen. More people
I mean,
were able to become tradesmen because the printing press enabled the transfer of knowledge regarding how to accomplish complex skills. And
I
there was a
suppose.
skyrocketing in literacy as a result. But yeah, you still had a huge exodus of people from rural farmlands, even ones that were homesteaded, to cities because hey, the government decided to do some what's the term that going on in the U.S. where they just straight up take people's land, eminent domain. Yeah, the governments at the time, because they were transitioning from a feudalist to a mercantilist style political economy, they figured that it was better to give it to large mercantile houses rather than, let people let people have their land and just, not be predatory assholes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the concept of a like liberal political order, because you brought up printing presses. The invention of the printing press was another subversive technology, although it wasn't really central to the Industrial Revolution. It was invented a couple hundred years before. But yeah, the way political orders up until that point, at least narrative wise, were maintained, the way that the state was able to control that was just by controlling who was literate or not, because pretty much anybody could teach themselves to read. Yeah, the state needed to invent ye old psyop in order to manufacture a perceived sense of investment in political institutions. Hence, we are political institutions. They represent us. Hence, the state started promoting that notion.
Well, I find it kind of funny, because this was going into the point that I made earlier. Just because you get a choice doesn't mean it's voluntary.
Yeah, the conditions that this even being a predicament, it that being made around can be determined by coercion. Like I mean, I'm sure people being forced off of their farmlands because the state chose to recognize their farms as being the private property of somebody else. I'm sure that that was a better option for them because the alternative is death.
Hmm.
Yeah, if they didn't leave, the state would come in and kill them. So.
I mean, that's what Thomas Hodgskin writes about in his book Popular Political Economy.
Which we'll dive into that once he starts to when he brings up Louis Blanc. because
Right.
yeah,
Well, I just wanted to mention in this aspect, Hodgkin goes into great detail about what we were just talking about and the issues behind it. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
mhm. Well,
So,
I'm gonna
anyways,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
go ahead.
continue more of it, and you guys ready?
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
So mercantilism replaces feudalism in the 16th, 18th centuries. It started off as trade between towns, but was not necessarily competitive trade. Initially, each town had vastly different products and services that were slowly homogenized by demand over time. After the homogenization of goods, trade was carried out in broader and broader circles, town to town, county to county, province to province, and finally nation to nation. And it's worth repeating that there's
Homogenized by
evidence of
demand. So people acting so literally according to him, the demands of people in a political economy in a completely different part of the country and who don't even influence the the other economy we're talking about, influence trends in that part, in that particular economy. And he's expecting people to believe that emerges as a result of people in that economy associating in pursuit of their own most highly valued preferences. Demand of people in a completely different part of the country is influencing prices in that particular economy. Just repeating.
Yeah, like like I said, like
That is fucking retarded.
like this is why I reject
And
capitalism. I'm not
that
against.
so obviously is the result of political planning.
Yeah, like there are so many different reasons as to why I reject capitalism, and Shane's basically showing reasons as to why we shouldn't be using the term capitalism to begin with. It's funny to see.
Yet he has so much emotional and financial, and I mentioned this term earlier, egotistical investment in the term that he's never going to change his tune.
It doesn't even question that. Just demand in a completely different community influences prices in another, and he just glosses over it like he didn't just say something completely absurd if you actually think about it for more than 5 seconds.
Well, I'm just going to say it. Shane is an egotist. I
Uh,
don't know. I don't know if I want to say he's. I don't think I can go so far as to say he's narcissistic, but he's definitely got a massive raging ego, and it's a huge blind spot that's actively preventing him from being able to achieve knowledge or discover knowledge.
uh, yeah, basically, I think it's sort of like the I guess program thinking as to like, oh, you're against capitalism, that means you want to take away my freedoms. No,
Yeah, he's
go ahead.
he's just looking for explanations for how what he's describing conforms to his internal narrative of reality, regardless of whether or not they make sense.
And he's running
So
into
if
contradiction.
he can find an explanation, even if that contradicts openly some other part of his thinking, it doesn't really matter. It's an explanation he can throw out,
Yeah.
and that can protect his internal narrative of reality.
uh like I'm sorry to say, but most thin boys are seem like central planners.
They are central planners. Talk about them for long enough, and you'll eventually come to realize that they're all legal positivists. The only problem that they have fundamentally with state rule is that it's doing things that they don't like. They're no different than a Republican or Democrat. They're just slightly more different. They're just a slightly, or the differences between them and a Democrat or a Republican are just a little bit more than what is otherwise allowable within the Overton window. but fundamentally, there's really nothing different. It's just that the central political organization that dictates the terms by which society organizes and controls people's lives is just different. And it's not a state, you guys, we promise. It's just a political organization. It's completely different.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm gonna continue it, and I'm hoping that he brings up like Louis Blanc soon.
Political libertarians be like, we're just like Republicans, except instead of the state using a party pretext to justify itself, we think Disney should own everything. We think Disney should run the political economy, and Disney should be the state. Sorry, not a state. DRO. Really not a state.
It's not a state when we do it. Exactly. But
Our covenant community.
Anyways, continue.
yeah.
Of intercontinental trade routes going back 80,000 years, at least. So that's an indication right there that what we're talking about with this international trade is pretty much the natural state of mankind.
No.
And what governments and city-states and feudalist
that proves
systems were doing were
markets
inhibiting
existed.
that. And so this was basically a reclaiming of our rights to trade with
Doesn't
whoever we
say
wanted
anything
to.
for political systems. In fact, at the if you go back 80 to 100,000 years ago, there more than likely weren't even enough people or political systems to be able to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so they go into colonialism and mercantilism. Most colonies were set up with an economic system that smacked of feudalism, with their raw goods going back to the motherland. In the case of the British colonies in North America, being forced to repurchase the finished product with a pseudo-currency that prevented them from trading with other nations.
How is that any different than fiat currency that exists in modernity, though?
It's different because we say it's different.
And if you question me, I'm gonna ban you.
Pretty much.
But the state, by policy, prevented people from trading with other nations. Yeah, and and in modernity, the World Bank has to, or an organization or a treaty like it, in order to trade internationally, has to set rates that the currencies.
I think we're back up.
Let me check.
Let's make sure everyone can hear.
If I'm still up, sorry everyone. The Wi-Fi cut out for a second.
When I try to watch the stream, it says that it's still live, but it stops at a certain point. So I don't know what the hell's up with that.
Yep, I can hear you. On the
Okay.
stream.
Okay.
Well,
I have my own version of the stream just so I can keep up with chat.
yeah.
Hey,
We're
sorry
back.
about that, everybody. Gavi's internet crapped out, so guess we'll have treated that as a short intermission.
Yeah, but do not threat. We're halfway through this, and basically, yeah, we're almost done with this, I guess. But anyways, should we continue?
Sure, but I'm not seeing anything on my end, at least as far as the video that you're. Let me try refreshing. Okay, never mind. I got it.
All right. Well, in 3, 2, 1.
Into the Industrial Revolution, the often literal gold mine of colonialism, which had brought new wealth and demand for the products of domestic industries, which drove the expansion and mechanization of production as technology leaped ahead and factories no longer had to be built near waterways or windmills to function. Industrialists began building in the cities where there were now thousands of people to supply ready labor. Industrial tycoons were the first people to amass their wealth in their lifetimes, often outstripping both the landed nobles and many of the money-lending and banking families. And aren't we continually told the exact opposite of this? They say, oh, well, you know, the Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and all of those, well, they were just part of this aristocratic. No. They started basically from nothing. And they built their own wealth. And this was the first time in history.
At this point, I actually can't tell if Shane is being just purely ignorant or is actually actively deceiving his audience. To paraphrase Shane and applying it directly to Shane, lie, 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 lie. I mean, we know that just in the case of Vanderbilt, he was a massive beneficiary of the massively discounted rates at which the United States federal government was giving to railroad firms in order to allow them to build their ridiculous railways, and to say nothing of the cartelized passenger and freight rates that were demanded by various railroad cartels in the mid to late 19th century, which of course Vanderbilt greatly benefited from. And then Rockefeller was basically the only real comparison I can think of in regards to what a complete and total evil asshole he was, is that he was the Bill Gates of his day. Just complete and utter malevolence in human form. Who was the son of a literal snake oil salesman.
Yeah,
where do we even begin with Rockefeller?
But no, they got their capital fairly, you see. All those people that got quote unquote mistreated by the Rockefellers, they voluntarily got mistreated.
Yeah, and Carnegie is literally the reason. Big part, him coordinating with the U.S. government at least is a big part of the reason why mutual aid healthcare doesn't exist anymore. Specifically, cartelizing the medical industry, which is a big part of the reason why we see today the insane prices for medicine and medical practices.
Well, I was just taking a quick drink. Sorry about that. Should we continue?
Yeah, Rockefeller. I mean, if you want to see a good documentary about John Rockefeller, you could watch James Corbett, and how a big part of the reason why engines are even still designed the way they are today is because of James Corbett on Rockefeller, is because of is specifically because of him cartelizing a big part of the white market, collaborating with the state, which the state has, of course, a mutual interest in, because of course engines being based upon a fuel source, the supply distribution of which can easily be monopolized, would allow the state to control it, and therefore makes it a lot easier for the state to control administered prices in the white market, but also gives the state something to base its fiat currency on, because of how consistent the manufactured demand for it was.
Mm-hmm.
By this particular fiat property norm, by this particular aspect of political planning. The point where this is even still the case today, where the supply of oil is directly backed by is directly used to base the supply, is directly used to states use the supply chains of oil as they force legal entities to use their currencies in order to manufacture demand for their currencies in order to create a consistent price scheme for their particular fiat currencies. So literally, like the effect of the Rockefeller Foundation and the various corporate entities that he was the head of. We're still seeing the state benefiting from that today, much to the expense of the progress of technology and people being able to control their own sense of profit, how they use their resources.
Well, yeah, basically, I don't think, the ANCAPs are, at least most of the ANCAPs are not going to understand that.
Any technology that comes along that would disrupt the supply chains of oil, yeah, the inventors of those are usually found with 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head after they committed suicide.
Truth, it was a tragic weightlifting accident. Anyways, I think we can continue here.
Yeah.
Yep.
That could happen. It's every other political system that has wealth being handed down in big
Hold on a
families and
second. Pause.
huge.
Shane just admitted that capitalism is a political system.
Well, that's not even controversial based on the fact that he keeps talking about it as a system throughout this video, but yeah, he referred to it explicitly as one here, so.
And so the question I then leave up to the audience is, remind me how Shane is an anarchist again?
I'm an anarchist because I think everything should be voluntary, including the state. The state can be theoretically voluntary if people really want it.
All right, so it's just one of those clap your hands if you believe kind of things.
Yeah, rain dance.
So remind me again how Shane is this great knowledgeable scientist who just knows all about the science and the scientisms, and yet somehow always comes up with these faith-based arguments.
What counts as property if what determines an act to be a claim of property is determined arbitrarily and exclusively by the people running a political system?
Mm-hmm.
And since there is no way of determining this, then how can you say that your end achieves a libertarian end?
Well, anyway, should we continue?
Sure.
Classes. It says, with capitalism, for the first time in history, common people could have hopes of becoming wealthy. The new money crowd built more factories that required more labor while also producing more goods for people to purchase. During this period, the term capitalism, originating from the Latin word capitalis, which means head of cattle, was first used by French socialist Louis Blanc in 1850 to
lie. You want to correct him on this one, Nate, if you want to?
To be fair, it's not the claim that Shane's making; it's a claim that in the Investopedia article is.
Well,
Yeah.
To be fair, also he's the one support. So he's kind of letting this article represent him.
Yeah, that's true.
So, do you want to talk about Thomas Hodgskin for a minute? Nate?
Me?
Yeah.
Me? Sure. So he was a free market anarchist from back in the he was born in the late 18th century. He wrote a book called Popular Political Economy, as I had mentioned earlier, probably, where he is talking about how how capitalists are using political organization to oppress workers or exploit them as well. So, and he does so in surprisingly modern tones. And anarchists of every stripe have actually used that description of capitalism from that inception onwards, up until Rothbard decided to, but yeah, but his main complaint in popular political economy is is how political organization has been uh, has been used to exploit the workers. So
Yeah,
that's just a yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, Thomas Hodgkin was the first one to coin the term capitalist, and that actually derived into like capitalism and stuff like that. So the saying that Louis Blanc was the original one who created capitalist and capitalism is outright false.
Yeah.
Not that it matters, but I'm kind of attacking from his standpoint on his like what he's presenting as fact, because it's not fact.
Yeah. I thought about reading a little of what Hodgkin had wrote in his book.
Hmm.
You would have to read pages 50, 51, and 52 for full context, because it's a lot of it's a lot to unpack here. But anyways, he wrote, quote, each laborer in all civilized societies maintains many persons. The importance of establishing the principle that all labor is productive, which subsists the laborer arises from the prevalent theories relative to capital and the universal practice of capitalists. It is maintained, for example, that labor is not productive, and in fact, the laborer is not allowed to work unless, in addition to replacing whatever he uses or consumes and comfortably subsisting himself, his labor also gives a profit to the capitalists on all the capital which he uses or consumes while engaging in producing, or unless his labor produces a great deal more in the present state of society than will suffice for his own comfortable subsistence, capitalists becoming the proprietors of all the wealth of the society as it is produced, act on this principle, and never as the rule will they suffer laborers to have the means of subsistence unless they have a confident expectation that their labor will produce a profit over and above their own substance. Sorry, it's a tongue twister. This is so palpable a violation of the natural principle above stated. It is so completely the principle of slavery to starve the laborer unless his labor will feed his master as well as himself, that we must not be surprised if we should find it one of the chief causes, wherever it exists, and it exists almost universally, of the poverty and wretchedness of the laboring classes. To develop this truth belongs to another part of this book, but it was impossible to speak of productive labor without pointing out its extreme limit and without adverting as well to the opposite theory as to the social practice which condemns men to starvation unless their labor will produce much more than they require for their own use or consumption. End quote.
Well, there you go.
and and of course, I should point out that Marxists, even if they even if they make the same claim, they're missing the point because they're supporting political organization to get rid of political organization, and Hodgkin is making the exact case we're trying to make, which is get rid of the political organization.
They're engaging in the exact same mistake that Shane is, just with the with the morality roles reversed.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, Like,
ultimately, because states are ultimately determined by political organization, ideology doesn't matter. So in terms of how the actual organization's nature functions, any state, even down to the political economy that is adopted, is going to be determined by whatever those particular political institutions need to sustain themselves.
Yeah.
So, but also, yeah, also what they're proposing is not actually a critique of any of the problems with capitalism that they're pointing out, because these are actually problems that emerge because of fiat property norms, which they openly acknowledge, but they ascribe this to ideological prescriptions created by that particular political model. And just if the people in charge were promoting a different set of fiat property norms, well, then you would have a different political economy without those problems. They don't have the same. I'm not saying that they have the exact same like they would declare the exact same ideology, but in terms of how they view society and how they view norms in relation to society, point to me the meaningful difference between Shane and a Marxist.
mm-hmm. Well,
Or anyone else who has the political view of society, for that matter, because they all fundamentally operate around the same assumptions.
If I may, real quick, there's one brief thing I'd like to mention that Hodgskin wrote in an essay.
sure.
And he said, when we have settled the question, however, as to the claims of capital or labor, we shall have proceeded only one step towards ascertaining what ought now to be the wages of labor. The other parts of the inquiry will, I trust, be entered into by some of my fellow laborers, and I shall content myself at present with examining the claims of the capitalists as supported by the theories of political economy. And this is from his, I believe, his essay, Labor Defended Against the Claims of Capital, from 1825.
Yeah, so Thomas Hodgkin's, being pretty based on the social question, or whether or not political economies were valid. Although, centering this what we would now refer to as people being able to control what they count as profit, rhetorically referring to this as the true product of one's labor, the true wage, because of lack of economic understanding in the early 1800s. That's something that can be excused, but that's what they're ultimately referring to, and that's something that was made pretty explicit just by what the passages Nate referenced.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what Tucker was writing about in his essays on socialism. Though I'm not going to read that because it's a lot. It's a lot of context to put out there.
But
anyways,
if you guys want to actually check these sources out for yourself, I will link these in the description along with a few other sources. But yeah, moving on to the next point that Shane's bringing up about how capitalism is not anarchist. Let's continue this.
All right.
Signify a system of exclusive ownership of industrial means of production by private individuals rather than shared ownership. So please stop claiming that Karl Marx coined the term and we should use his definition. He did not. These are right there. Karl Marx did not coin the term capitalism.
At least we agree on something. Thomas Hodgskin coined the term, as we stated before.
Although he certainly contributed to its rise of use. All right, so industrial capitalism tended to benefit more levels of society rather than just the aristocratic class. We are told the opposite. It just ain't true. Wages increased, helped greatly by the formation of unions. This is another myth. I've talked about this before. Unions are free market. Before unions, you did have these things called guilds. But it was like if you wanted to be a particular trade person, you were forced to join a guild, and there was one guild that was given special dispensation by the crown. Well, the free market formed unions, which were voluntary organizations. The government actually fought. Government ended up capturing those, particularly under FDR. And so now what do we have? Well, we have a lot of states where, if you want to work in a certain industry, you're not only forced to join a union, you're often forced to join one particular union. That has a lot more to do with the guild.
Like they were in mercantilism.
You also have corporate
Capitalism.
law and licensing standards for what counts as a white market firm. By the way, even if those didn't exist, the only reason that those exist is simply to make it more efficient for the state to be able to plan how resources are distributed and see where they're being distributed, or to control more specifically to control people in an increasing number of ways, so that the state doesn't have to do this through some sort of third-party institution.
Yep, and I guess if I was gonna say something that everybody else said, which basically is we already know at this point, capitalism is political. That's why we don't use it. Shane needs to get this point.
He's not going to. As I said before, he has an egotistical need to be right about this. And I'm going to admit that I have an egotistical need to be correct as well, and an emotional investment in it. However, I at least like to think that I prefer to be correct rather than forcing truth to conform to me. So if I'm wrong about something, I'll at least try to adjust my understanding so that I can be correct later rather than continue being wrong now.
Well, I
Doesn't seem
don't,
it.
and the reason why I don't is because because regardless of what people believe around me, I know specifically what means will result in political organization being subverted. So if I just act towards accomplishing those means, producing the things that will cause that to happen, I will end up achieving the end of the end of the libertarian movement, by which I mean the end it's trying to achieve, regardless of what people think.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you have to take into consideration is because of the extent to which political institutions are able to control the frame of reference that most people have. And because the philosophical side of the libertarian movement, at least, has already made itself unable to distinguish itself from political infiltrators like Hoppe and people like Shane. There probably is not going to be that alone has made it impossible for there to be any sort of philosophical renaissance caused by libertarianism. Or if it does happen, it's going to be, another philosophy masquerading under the name of libertarianism that gets astroturfed by the state, as we're already seeing with the paleo movement. But
Yep. Not just the paleo movement, we're also seeing them with the vulgaritarians with the fake ancoms.
Yeah, well, them as well. But yeah, as in terms of the philosophical movement of libertarianism, if it is even possible to salvage it because of so many people who are basically just Republicans who identify themselves as libertarians and identify their position as libertarianism. If it does happen, it's going to happen post state, where none of the emotional and financial investment that people perceive in maintaining political institutions are present, and therefore people aren't politicized in mass because there's nothing ultimately upholding that internal narrative that society and political organization is the same thing, because political organization's not present, so that's obviously not the case.
Yeah, but to continue, I guess. You guys ready?
Yes.
Yeah, but just very quickly, if the philosophical side of the libertarian movement is it, if it has any hope of ever actually representing um like the actual methodology of libertarian, like that informs how libertarians determine what counts as a concept, you are going to have to gatekeep people like Shane and Hoppa out of those circles and make it very clear why what they're claiming doesn't count as libertarianism.
Yeah. Well, in 3, 2, 1.
Guilds of the Middle Ages than it does with the unions of the 19th century. So let's stop that myth in its tracks as well. The standard of living also increased with the glut of affordable products being mass-produced. This growth led to the formation of a middle class. Again, exactly the opposite of what we're told. We're told that capitalism destroys the middle class. No. It's the only reason why there is a middle class.
Do you guys want to comment on that, or?
No, just keep going.
All right.
And began to lift more and more people from the lower classes to swell its ranks. The economic freedoms of capitalism matured alongside democratic political freedoms, liberal individualism, and the theory of natural rights. He goes into Milton Friedman. He says capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. It is not a sufficient condition. We can see that in Singapore. Singapore, I think for I don't even know how many years, has been number 2 on the Economic Freedom Index. It's a very...
Is Singapore anarchist though?
It's
No,
not.
he's actually citing them as an example of, or Shane is trying to cite Singapore as an example of a place that nominally has a lot of economic freedom, or at least based on cardinal measurements used in economic freedom indexes. However, in terms of personal freedom, you actually can't chew gum on the streets.
Creating a dichotomy, an arbitrary dichotomy, because ultimately both of those, in terms of the nature of those things, are just how people are able to act. And while states exist, regardless of what the state permits you to do, the only things that you can do you only can do that because the state permits you to, and that's not actually freedom.
Well, like, it also doesn't make sense, like, because what Shane's trying to do is trying to rate states on a scale, which I've seen a lot of Thinner Boys do lately, and it doesn't really make sense to rate force on a scale, because force
Yeah.
is still force,
Oh.
and that's like choosing your favorite candy, but except you're choosing which way you want to get punished.
Well, it doesn't make sense also for the reason that I just noted as well. Well, that, and because political organization is, regardless of the political economy, it exists because organizations are able to establish them and therefore act with impunity, in determining and completely determine the actions that other people are able to engage in with the threat of force. So, while a state exists, it doesn't really make sense to talk about them like this, because the fact that the state exists means there's an organization that has the power to do this, and consequently, you don't have freedom. You don't have the ability to make claims, and you don't have the ability um, to economize with your own resources around the interests that you determine for yourself, because the state is going to use force to determine these things for you.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was going to add is that that the emergence of technology is ultimately going to, and specifically what trends technologies developed around, is going to determine the way that social norms emerge outside of the ability for ideology or any sort of political institutions to control them, which is why furthering the development of certain techniques that will lead to technology developing a certain way is ultimate in ways that are subversive to the state's ability to sustain its organization. It's ultimately the only thing that can really count as a libertarian means. It's the only thing that can really count as both productive and simultaneously disruptive to their ability to coordinate, which a libertarian means has to do both. It has to complement the ability for people to inform their own incentives, and it does this by disrupting the influence of political institutions over how people invest and their access to resources, and it simultaneously has to make it a lot easier for people to organize in local economies in order to complement these means that people can use to operate outside of the influence of political institutions. The latter, no, the latter goal is the only part of that that has yet to be achieved. As
Mhm.
far as the tools to control what we produce and how we produce them, pretty much. I mean, we pretty much already, can start there's this urban farming movement that's spreading out that's popping up all over the US, but even if that wasn't the case, you could start a garden and farm your own animals. You can 3D print whatever technology you need to create guns, to create any tools that you want, to create even fucking nuclear reactors. And of course, cryptocurrencies exist, so when political institutions have been subverted, they can emerge as commodity money.
Mm-hmm. Uh, and I guess I'll continue this and stuff like that, and so we could just wrap this up.
Yeah, it's getting kind of late.
A free country, economically speaking, not so much in other areas where you can be caned if you're, caught chewing gum or whatever. They've got a lot of crazy laws like that. So you have to have capitalism if you want to be free, but there's more to being free than just capitalism. So
Keep playing.
a dramatic expansion of the financial sector accompanied the rise of industrial capitalism. Banks had previously served as warehouses for valuables, clearinghouses for long-distance trade, or lenders to nobles and governments. And this goes back to a lot of what I've read of Lysander Spooner talking about what he was complaining about. Now, they came to serve the needs of everyday commerce and the intermediation of credit for large long-term investment projects. And it was the usury laws that kept getting in the way of it, as Spooner kept complaining about. By the 20th century, as stock exchanges became increasingly
not the-
public and investment vehicles opened up to more individuals, some economists identified a variation on the system, financial capitalism.
He was complaining about the existence of that framework itself in a plan that exists because of political planning.
think-
Pretty explicit. He was pretty explicit in his writings, from what I had read. I mean, I can guarantee you, political economy or political organization will pop up several times in many of these essays you read from these guys. Hodgskin be one of them.
Yeah. Basically, and there's a reason why there like the state wants to basically make it to where they want to make people think that libertarianism is somehow this political movement that in any way they seem possible, like
The
Yeah,
partyarchy,
because
or the
because if it's
partyarchy.
because if it's a political movement, then the only conclusions that people who are within those philosophical circles can come to about it is fundamentally one which conforms to the narrative that states promote about their association with society, and therefore can't analyze the state in a way which would allow them to come to conclusions that are subversive to its organization model, and therefore can't be a threat to it.
hmm
That's the reason that the state does this.
yeah, and I guess anyways to continue playing.
And they also go into economic growth. And they say before the rise of capitalism, rapid economic growth occurred primarily through conquest and extraction of resources. Research suggests average global per capita income was unchanged between the rise of agricultural societies through approximately 1750, when the roots of the first industrial revolution took hold. There you go.
No.
And in subsequent centuries, capitalist production processes have greatly enhanced productive capacity. More and better goods became cheaply available to wide populations, raising standards of living in previously unthinkable ways. Most political theorists and nearly all economists argue that capitalism is the most efficient and productive system of exchange. Boo-yah.
I love how much emphasis he puts on that. You can't just make the argument that capitalism is the best, most efficient, most productive. Insert positive adjective here. He has to say like, well, I said all that, but most experts agree with what I said. So get wrecked, libtards. Ha! Experts agree with me. Experts don't agree with you. Ha! I win.
I just want to imagine a Nazi soldier saying "boo, yeah," and saying because he's agreeing with most of the mainstream political science.
Yeah, it's such grug-brained thinking. I mean, it really is.
just because they say they're experts.
It's so unfortunate that the population had to boom to the point where political organization was possible before the unfortunate holdover from lower stages of our evolution that caused cognitive dissonance to be triggered but before that was selected out of our genes. Because if that happened, we wouldn't be getting shit like this, where you could exploit people by manufacturing internal tribal narrative within your organization controlling society that causes people to associate what's actually controlling society with other tribes rather than the organization itself, and consequently can't see the organization as the actual threat.
Mm-hmm. But Anyways, to continue this, because I'm pretty sure he's gonna like he's gonna say something that is you'll just see.
All right, going into capitalism versus socialism. The fundamental difference between capitalism and socialism is the ownership and control of the means of production. In a capitalist economy, property and businesses are owned and controlled by individuals. In a socialist economy, the state owns and manages the vital means of production. And they go
isn't that also the definition of capitalism, but you just like contort that into like the private ownership, because government can also have a private ownership of the means of production too. Most people
I
don't
mean,
realize that.
legally, the U.S. federal government is a corporation, so it's possible that you have a situation where, if, say, the Soviet Union declared itself to be a corporation and then legally owned everything in the Soviet Union, it would exist in a state of capitalism and socialism simultaneously, and thus we have a very interesting demarcation problem where, yeah, you have two. We're expected to believe that capitalism and socialism are mutually exclusive to one another, even though they can exist simultaneously just through legal fiat.
The problem is also not the problem fundamentally again is that these aren't actual claims over resources being made, so they don't actually count as property. While a state exists, doesn't actually count as property because the state can just come along and sign your claim, or can simply make a competing claim and assign it to someone else, and you can't do anything about it. And that's ultimately the point that I was making earlier, is that what counts as a claim while a state exists, because that's ultimately determined by the state's legal framework, is fundamentally arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess anyways, to continue.
That's okay. Go ahead.
into other differences like equity, where capitalism isn't concerned about equity and socialism has it as a primary goal. But I would point out another phrase Milton Friedman oft repeated: a society that values equality over freedom will end up with neither one, but a society that values freedom over equality will wind up with a great measure of both. And then there's efficiency. Capitalism.
That the norms that emerge in society are determined by belief, right?
Of course. I mean, we just get enough people to believe in anything, and suddenly those things just happen, because that's how social organization works.
But what counts as a society in this sense, and what exact amount of people needs to believe in something in order for a norm to emerge, or in order for it to be valid?
Enough.
In fact, if the concept only, what causes it to emerge is just belief, then what counts as the concept? How do you know that what people? How can you know that when they're referring to that concept, they are actually referring to the same thing, since there isn't any sort of methodological basis for what causes the concept to emerge? People must just be projecting an internal mental image of what they associate with it onto the concept. In which case, how do you know they all have the same mental image? In which case, how does a norm emerge based on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and basically, I'm sure Shane has like the boomer mentality on how currency works too, and he probably thinks that well, like, people believe in currency. That's how it works, and that's how society functions.
Oh, I know that he does because he's on numerous occasions has characterized fiat as a product of the Federal Reserve Act, as though there was a point where the state existed but fiat currency simultaneously didn't exist. So that means that there is a point, at least in the history of the U.S. government, where he necessarily has to have considered the money that was used to be something that emerged as a product of free association, according to his internal reasoning.
Hmm. But yeah,
Which for the record, that's never been the case. That's never been the case. Any currency that is issued by a reserve banking model is by default fiat because it's literally only money, uh, because it's distributed at the rates planned by the institution that is distributing it, and the only way that it can become money is if supply chains are planned around it, which is which is exactly how currency, even from the start of the U.S. The U.S. worked, but really you can see this with any fiat currency. It is required for a fiat currency to emerge. Because if this wasn't the case, then anyone could create it requires financial planning, because if financial planning wasn't present, then anyone would be able to introduce their own supply of the money into circulation, in which case there wouldn't be a supply cap for it. In which case it couldn't have value because it wouldn't be able to have supply on the supply demand curves.
I'm quite certain that if Shane were to reply, he would say that, oh, his currency would have commodity backing. It would just have a gold standard. But he's already at the point where he's centrally planning a currency and demanding that vendors only accept their proprietary fiat currency, in which case he's already created a controlled economy. And as that agorist meme we've been sharing around, they've basically established a microstate. You've created a black market. Prepare for counter economics.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say about that, is that doesn't actually address the problem. That's still that only pushes the problem back a step further, and instead of the supply of the currency needing to be controlled, it's the supply of gold that needs to be controlled, with the trade of it being backed by the currency.
well, yeah, I guess, anyways, to continue, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is greatly more efficient than socialism. Employments, this is kind of a kooky one. Because what do we hear? Oh, well, Cuba, the Soviet Union, they had full employment. Well, yeah, when they can force you to work in the gulags, that's what happens.
Shane, like I said before, just because there's more choices involved in other systems doesn't make it good or viable in any means. Like,
or even ethical.
Gun is being held to yours and the heads of 5 merchants that you can associate with. And guns, well, in more specifically in the case of capitalism, it would be guns being held to the heads of people that continue to supply the merchants, and guns being held at the merchants if forcing them to associate with suppliers that are decided by the state. And yes, of course, the consumer has a gun held to their head and is told that they're only able to associate with certain state-approved vendors. But yeah, so the associate you have a choice, but I mean, it's not really. It's if you try to do anything outside of that narrow choice, the state will harass you every step of the way.
Yeah. And
It's not
basically,
really a choice.
I see a conflation to where thin libertarians look at governments that can and then they look at they look at the weird sort of counter economy and try to apply that to the political economy and try to say, see, this is how capitalism works and this is why capitalism works.
Treated as though there's no difference between them, which yes, there is. First of all, counter economies are determined entirely by the actions taken by individuals who are producing their own resources and aren't associating around the fixed rates set by the state and aren't associating through political institutions. Therefore, are creating profit outside of political institutions.
If I may, real quick, wasn't that what Rothbard was trying to criticize Konkin on in his critique of agorism?
What specifically?
What Gavi had mentioned just before what you had said.
You would have to point to a specific part of Rothbard's reply to Konkin here, because
well, it's been a while since I've read it, but I was just asking if that was one of the criticisms that Rothbard had made.
What specifically? Because that wasn't very well. Because Gavi went over a few points in what they'd said.
Yeah, basically, I think what he's trying to say is basically how the counter economy is anti-capitalist, which is why we shouldn't support it. Or
yeah, I don't recall seeing any section like that in his reply to Konkin.
Well, mostly his reply to Konkin was about how, or was Rothbard attempting to claim that Konkin was making some kind of prescriptive claim regarding that wage labor and various other aspects of modernity and modern day political economies are things that he wants to ban, which is obviously not what Rothbard said, but I'm sorry, that's not what Konkin said, but Rothbard was attempting to paint attempting to paint Konkin as some kind of central planner.
Basically, I'm sorry, but Rothbard is more of a central planner than Konkin is.
Well, I mean, at that time,
life, yeah.
Yeah, like, that's probably what I was asking.
Late 70s onwards, Rothbard was, or as we refer to in the back alley, Rothbad was a central planner in every sense of the word. He went full paleo and was unironically proposing the use of political means. I think he just straight up abandoned his anti-political ends by that point as well, because I actually don't recall him like saying anything about the end goals that he seeks to reach, other than vague platitudes regarding libertarian ends, which at no point does he ever describe.
Well,
so it seems this is actually, I'm kind of sidetracking here, and I do apologize, but I've noticed that quite a lot in paleo writing and literature, that they're very oblique in terms of describing the ends they seek to bring about. It's always just vague. It's always just libertarian ends. Like you'll see this from from Rothbard to Hop to Lew Rockwell to Stefan Kinsella to a lot of these paleo figures will always try to say like, this is what these blatantly political means that we seek to use will lead to libertarian ends, and they never describe it. They never describe what the ends. It's up to the audience to kind of fill in their own details as to what that libertarian end, quote unquote, actually looks like. And I see that as, well, blatantly disingenuous. It's a form of manipulation where you get people to basically write the essay for them, and because they've inserted themselves into the essay and they've reached their own conclusions about what this essay means, it makes it much more easy for them to accept what is blatantly, obviously propaganda.
If you saw my debate with Liquid Zulu, this was made particularly apparent because, you know, for almost every point he relied heavily upon it, but this is because, at least as far as attempted intellectual justifications for how paleos come to these conclusions, it's because every single concept that they refer to in relation to ethics, they justify their conclusion through engaging in presupposition. And the problem with that is when you are simply engaging in a circular argument to rationalize how something is valid, you're not actually, you can't by default show how what the concept means, because you can't ever point to any sort of methodology to determine what it is, because what it is just something that is because it is. And this allows them, as you pointed out, to engage in goalpost shifting, which they do either consciously or not, because these concepts they're referring to within their argumentative framework don't actually mean anything.
Yeah. Well, I guess anyways, to wrap this up, and well, not the live stream, but like since there's 7 minutes left, let's try to get through it as much as we can. And if we need to reply, just let me know.
All right.
That's not a thing. The slave class before the Civil War in the United States, there was full employment among all the slaves. Yay, full employment. You know, that's not, you know, if you're forced to work, or if your job is digging a ditch and filling it back in again, then what's the point? The whole point of employment is to produce things that increase wealth for others. So yeah, I mean, this obsession with full employment isn't what you want. You want natural levels of unemployment, which is just what you naturally get from people switching jobs, or contractors contracting their labor, and maybe they don't have like the next project set up when one is finished, and it takes them a little bit of time. Sorry, I hit the microphone there. But then they talk about a mixed system. A mixed system respects property rights, but
just to point out, but before he goes on, this sort of the mixed system thing sort of implies like capitalism again is a political system. How can you have there is no such thing as a like, you know, people don't say like, oh yeah, this is a mixed libertarian system. It's slightly authoritarian and slightly free, because that doesn't make any sense. Like, what?
Libertarian.
Sorry,
I was just going to remark that libertarianism, and more concretely anarchism, is what emerges when political organizations aren't present in society. And so there's really no such thing as like mixed anarchy, because that concept just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, that does beg the question, though: is Shane an anarchist? I'm sure he would say he is, but I don't think he has any concept as to what anarchism actually is, causes it to emerge, and what its entailments are.
Yeah. But I'm gonna let him speak to continue and see what his points are.
places limit on them. This is basically every Western country. Property owners are restricted with regards to how they exchange one another. Minimum wage laws, tariffs, quotas, windfall taxes, license restrictions, prohibited products or contracts, direct public expropriation, antitrust legislation, legal tender laws, subsidies, and eminent domain. All sorts of things. Governments intruding on this makes an economy not be capitalist, but be mixed. It says, in contrast, pure capitalism, also known as laissez-faire capitalism or anarcho-capitalism, such as professed by Murray Rothbard, all industries are left up to private ownership and operation, including public goods, and no central government authority provides regulation or supervision of economic activity in general. When you're talking about regulatory capture, when you're talking about industries going to government to get favors, when you're talking about government providing subsidies to crony corporations or whatever, that's not capitalism. It's just not. And here it is right here in black and white. So it says, by definition, nearly every country in the world has a mixed economy. And
well, I can see, this article seems really disingenuous. They're using lingo to seem like they want to get to libertarian thinkers, right? And then make them start thinking about the political economy and how it's irrelevant. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. It's just I don't really have anything to say to this point because everything that's wrong with it we've already addressed extensively.
Yeah.
So I think, and it goes into crony capitalism, but that's pretty much it for this one. And you can read through it, but the definitions we get from the socialists are just not correct at all.
They're more consistent.
I also wanted to look at this other one right quickly. This one's a lot shorter, but what role does the government play in capitalism? And in pure capitalism, the answer is none. And so we see this.
Actually, I think it's actually worth noting. I mean, I noted this when you and I were watching this a week and a half ago, Gavi. But I think it's worth pointing out to the audience. Capitalism and, of course, government policy. Capitalism was listed under the government and policy tab within Investopedia. So I bring a question up again. Shane, are you actually an anarchist?
Yeah, I mean, I would love him to answer. I mean, like you said, he would probably answer yes, or he would just probably say, I'm a quote-unquote private property person.
Like Robert.
I would love to see him make a response video and attempt to answer this question. And knowing him, he'll probably use a Darvo tactic of trying to play me out to be the bad guy for daring to question what a great and wonderful, incredible and knowledgeable and smart and scientific and big-brained and magnificent anarchist he is. How dare I? Yeah, I dare.
Put that in the server at least.
Oh, he does it. He did that every interaction I saw with him in both of his servers. Everything was just entirely about puffing up what a great and magnificent ego he has. In that conversation I mentioned much earlier in the stream I had with him regarding a topic that we're not allowed to discuss on a YouTube stream, he made the comment, "You used to be better. You were better than this." And obviously he was trying to emotionally manipulate me. He was trying to emotionally manipulate me through, guilt tripping. And I'm just thinking I just couldn't help but think to myself, wow, that's very, I mean, I said it already, manipulative of you. I see what you're trying to do there, and I didn't used to be better than that. What changed is that I used to agree with you on a lot of things. Now I've outgrown you. I've surpassed you. I don't want to say I'm better than him because I'm sure that there's plenty of things that spend certain specializations and skills that he would just kick my ass in.
Well,
whether or not they're related to, whether or not they're related to philosophy, economics, or what have you is irrelevant. But the point is that in this particular sphere of knowledge, Yeah, I am very comfortable in saying that I am more knowledgeable than he is, and I'm quite certain everyone else in the stream is as well.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is that it doesn't really make sense to look at people in a politically competitive way in relationship to one another, because whether or not someone can become specialized in a different way is ultimately just dependent on how they approach different topics. And in the case of Shane, it's pretty evident his biggest issue is that he's politicized as fuck. So yeah, if he weren't politicized, then I'm relatively sure that that's all that would really need to change, and then he could start developing a genuine understanding of social organization just as a study, understanding what actually counts as claims, and approaching ethics from a non-emotionally charged perspective. So yeah, no one is really better than anyone else in terms of their knowledge of something.
That's fair. I'm just stating that I consider myself to be more knowledgeable in the field of philosophy and economics than Shane is.
We definitely are, but as far as whether or not he can be too, yeah, he definitely could. It's just that he needs to change a few things, and he needs to he needs to do some studying of his own and pondering of his own.
At this particular instance in time, our knowledge is greater than his. That doesn't mean that would always be the case. So he could surpass me. It's just that I don't, at the current pace things are going, I don't see that happening.
As far as, why Heretic and I don't respect him, well, Heretic may have a different perspective, but I can't really get into on a YouTube stream why I don't, because it has relation to the topic that the WHO says we can't talk about, and Shane's particular stances on it, and the implications of them, as well as the entailed reasoning that caused him to come to his conclusion.
All I'm going to say on that topic is, Shane, if you're listening, you are getting your audience killed. You did that. And you're still doing that.
Sorry, wrong meeting.
Anyways, should we continue?
But yeah, we should continue.
Here, unlike socialism, communism, or fascism, capitalism does not assume a role for coercive, centralized public authority. While nearly all economic thinkers and policymakers argue in favor of some level of government influence in the economy, those interventions take place outside of the strictly defined confines of capitalism. I don't really know what more you need, but we'll look at the rest of this. It's not long. So capitalism was made famous by Karl Marx in Das Kapital. Today, capitalism refers to the organization of society under two central tenets: private ownership rights and voluntary trade. I go into John Locke again. Voluntary trade is the mechanism that drives activity in a capitalist system. The owners of resources compete with one another over consumers, who in turn compete with other consumers over goods and services. This is pretty much what they said in the last one as well. These concepts, private ownership and voluntary trade, are antagonistic with the nature of government. Governments are public, not private institutions. They do not engage voluntarily, but rather use taxes, regulations, police, and military to pursue objectives that are free of the considerations of capitalism. Basically, anything government does, anything that any forceful authority does,
not dichotomized against one another. Literally, but we went over this again extensively over the course of the stream. In order to be an actor in the state's political economy, you can only do so if you're trading around their rates, what they count as profit, and whether or not they recognize your claim to be able to. And that's true of any state.
Yeah. Basically, sorry, but you know, limitless ownership of land, like landlords owning like so many homes at once and like controlling the means on how people live in the home that, you know, they're quote unquote renting. That's not anarchist.
Not
That's
something that can emerge without political planning.
Yeah, which capitalism is like requires political planning. I think we said that like multiple times, but I think we're saying that multiple times because
Yeah.
the people who are gonna be Shane Killian fans are not gonna get that through their thick skulls.
I don't.
Like,
I would be interested genuinely to see the cognitive dissonance that would be the mental gymnastics that would be required in order to rationalize coming to this conclusion, Shane's conclusion.
well, I mean, knowing them,
Because
I don't know if Shane himself's going to watch it, but definitely someone in his inner circle is going to watch this entire thing, get to this point, and then they're going to go into the Shane's server or speak with Shane directly, just be like, "Oh my God, can you believe like what they're saying about you? Like it is just the worst. They don't understand anything about what you're saying, what you believe, and oh my God, that heretic guy, like heretic, he is so egotistical. Like, oh my God."
I've already explained why you can't just say why you can't just point to all of the things the government does as corporatism. We've already explained that extensively. We've already explained why why there is necessarily a problem in the concept of ownership from the libertarian perspective, which makes it incompatible with capitalism. We've already explained in great detail why that doesn't actually count as ownership and why associating in a white market doesn't actually count as doesn't count, or at the very least I should say, because it does count as economic action, but why people aren't actually able to control what they count as the end that they're trying to achieve. And therefore, what counts as efficiency or profit from the context of capitalism is determined by, is ultimately at least influenced directly by the state. And we've explained how these property norms, why these property norms can only exist because of the state. There is nowhere to go that would allow one who's trying to conflate these concepts and trying to reduce it to a mere semantics argument. There's nothing that they would have, and they can't just cite the definition. Some definition, say, see, look at the definition, you're wrong, because we're not even necessarily objecting. We're just acknowledging some nuances that are being glossed over in trying to simply refer to this quote unquote definition provided by the article
Oh,
that Shane's citing.
hold on a second. I'm looking in the comments right now, and Coy pointed out that exactly what I predicted is going on in Shane's channel right now, particularly in the Shilling channel, where people are freaking out about. I mean, it doesn't specify what they're freaking out about, but about just like how apparently I'm a
You said.
yeah. I really don't know how I feel about being correct about that kind of thing. Although I am kind of morbidly curious if they actually are calling me egotistical. Anyways,
To continue, I guess.
Not capitalism.
Okay, fine.
Sorry, no, you can.
I guess we can continue, but I don't know.
2 minutes left.
Okay, sure. Let's continue.
And so they talk about different forms of it: anarcho-capitalism, classical liberals, libertarians, minarchists, Libertarian is a little more of a big tent than what they're saying, because the term libertarian includes anarcho-capitalists as well, but they also talk about minarchists who argue that government should have nothing to do with the economy, but they should provide things like military, police, and courts. In the United States, most economists are identified as Keynesian, Chicago School, or classical liberal. Keynesian economists believe that capitalism largely works, but macroeconomic forces within the business cycle require government intervention to help smooth it out. They support fiscal and monetary policy, as well as other regulations on certain business activities. Chicago School economists tend to support a mild use of monetary policy and a lower level of regulation. In terms of political economy, capitalism is often pitted against socialism. Under socialism, the state owns the means of production and attempts to direct economic activity towards politically identified goals. Many modern European countries are a blend of socialism and capitalism, although their structure is generally closer to the fascist concepts of a public-private partnership with a planned economy. So can we please put this to rest once and for all?
No.
Can we not have anymore saying, well, you want capitalism and that means this and that? No, capitalism.
Our actual argument, no.
He's never going to acknowledge our actual argument. As far as he's concerned, he probably genuinely believes that we want a government that will ban people from saying the word capitalist, or we want some centralized authority to ban the existence of things that we have a distaste for, like landlords, or in my case, strawberry ice cream. Yeah, I want to ban strawberry ice cream. No, I don't. Obviously
Chocolate
not.
Master Race.
Mint chocolate chip. No, I'm kidding.
Anyways, so yeah, knowing how these people think, they are unironically trying to they're unironically going to misrepresent what our actual claims are, and just try to put us into a heavily politicized framework. Probably because it's simpler, because conceiving of concepts, particularly economic concepts, outside of a political framework is very counterintuitive for politicized people. And
so
to that, I am very...
become socialists.
Apparently. Apparently it's socialist to conceive of things outside of a political framework, even though conceptualizing literally everything in a political framework was the whole point of Marxism to begin with. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they're going to be able. I don't think Shane or his community are going to be able to ever represent our ideas correctly until they escape from the political framework entirely.
You're lying when you claim to be a free marketer. Lie. You
want to know something else? At no point in this stream did I even say I was a free marketer.
I don't care if you laid out exactly how you came to your conclusion, your methodology, and the epistemological basis that it's founded upon. That's not your real position.
Yeah, Shane, go ahead. Tell me more about what my real position is. By the way, just a quick update. Corey is saying that they're talking about how it's not possible for us to debunk a definition. I mean, I think we pointed that out at the beginning of the stream that...
more specifically, we explained why definitions don't count as a standard of evidence. And saying that you can't debunk it, well...
We don't have to.
That's exactly why. The purpose of argumentation over the nature of a concept is to understand its nature, therefore its definition.
Yeah, like
So
it wasn't.
When you just cite someone else's definition as a standard of evidence that's not based on anything, and anything can count for it. You can't debunk it because it's not a false. There isn't a standard of demarcation there.
Yeah,
it's unfalsifiable. Literally anything can count as capitalism. I can have this water bottle that I have in my hands right now. I just switched it around so that people could hear it, and that water bottle is capitalist. I'm not saying like I acquired it through capitalist means. No, the water bottle's mere existence itself is capitalistic.
But no, like basically we were never like supposed to be like telling people how they should use words. We were just pointing out how people shouldn't force us to use specific words we do not want to use, especially if those words are extremely inconsistent and like when you use those words, it usually makes people think that you're like making a legalist argument instead of an actual anarchist argument.
By the way, has anybody here been called a far leftist? Because recently I've been called that.
I get called a lot of things by a lot of people, and honestly, I don't really put much stock into it. I think it was like we were having a discussion with someone in our server who earnestly thought I was a left who called me a left libertarian, which I don't particularly take issue with, but I also just I reject the political spectrum entirely, and so I just see like why would I be lumped in with that when I don't recognize left or right as anything except thought-stopping anti-concepts.
It would be more. I mean, if we were to get down specifically to, at least if I were to get down specifically to an identifiable school of thought, likewise with from what you've described, I would best describe it as agora transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of makes the most sense to me. Although I just personally, if I were to assign myself a label, the simplest one would just be anarchist, or anarchist without adjectives if you prefer. But I just like to go with anarchist.
Well, yeah, we necessarily would be proponents of anarchism because that's the end that we're trying to achieve. What would create the end as described by libertarianism, which is anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although I do have to take just a quick side note. I do have to take umbrage with what someone said in the chat. Vanilla ice cream is not the best flavor.
Unless it's with chocolate and strawberry.
Get into the oven with all of the strawberries.
Hurry up.
Basically, yeah. I guess.
Check the chat. Check the chat.
I saw.
But no, but to wrap this whole thing up, let's get down to the conclusion and I guess end the stream.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, the conclusion is basically, or at the very least, my summation of my own conclusion. I'm not going to speak for everyone here. It's that words are defined by their users, not by authority figures that people just arbitrarily appeal to in order to make egotistical claims. You can't just cite some definition and assume that that makes your argument for you. No, you actually have to, make arguments. Weird, isn't it?
If you're referring to a concept, therefore you necessarily are making the claim, a truth claim about the nature of something that you're claiming exists and trying to characterize it. Then you can't just fall back on the subjectivity of language because you're claiming that you're pointing to something and trying to claim definitively that it has nature that can be demonstrated, in which case you need a methodology so that a standard of demarcation can determine exactly what it is.
Yep. And basically, I guess my conclude. Oh, sorry.
And all I was going to say is the concept of capitalism falls short because it describes the nature of a concept which is at least understanding capitalism as something that's compatible with the libertarian understanding of action is something that doesn't pan out because the concept of capitalism necessarily entails political assumptions about the nature of society, or at the very least, it describes a type of political economy, and therefore the claims and economic associations um, that would be characterized under it are the results of political planning and state fiat, all of which would be dictated by the existence of a state, and whether or not something is private is ultimately determined by uh, what claims the state chooses to defend rather than the actual actions taken, which puts it into direct conflict with how libertarians understand what a claim is or what their methodology for studying action would be.
Yeah, and I guess my conclusion is that every at least most definitions of the word capitalism are inherently like political, and like they require centralization to even exist.
All have to be.
Yeah, basically, what ANCAPs deem as property is vastly inconsistent, and like basically basically there is no real limit to what an individual can own. And I'm not trying to say that there should be someone from the top down that should be determining this limit, but it's more so that you can only you know maintain.
Capitalism, it describes a real concept, and that is the liberal understanding of what a free market is. But because that's a type of political economy, it runs into conflict with libertarianism for the various reasons expressed.
Mhm.
Sorry for interrupting.
You're fine. uh yeah, like uh things like uh landlords, or I guess what another instance is, basically,
CEOs.
CEOs, centralized banks are all technically capitalist, and basically ANCAPs tend to like you know think that because you have a choice, it makes it voluntary, even though no, that's not necessarily true. And caps either go basically just the market anarchist route, which includes agorism, left market anarchism, mutualism, etc., or they either go the paleo route, which is you know anarcho conservatism, anarcho monarchy, Hoppianism.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
because
the, the way I see it, people, and this is not just limited to them in particular, but just in general, when people's means and ends are in conflict, one of three things happens. Either they have to adjust their ends to be compatible with their means, they adjust their means to be compatible with their ends, even if there is just an attempt, or they go crazy. In the case of the ones that become, or the case of people like me and Esso, we adjusted our means. In the case of paleos, ones that go the monarchist, the feudalist, and fascist route, they adjust their ends. And in the case of the Rule 7 crowd, they just straight up go insane. They do
and
neither. They do neither of the above, and just assume that reality just doesn't exist.
Yep.
but
Well,
yeah, and specifically getting to back to like your last point, Gavi. The reason that this happens is specifically because of the main problem we've been highlighting this entire video, which is that ANCAPs, there isn't anything that informs what they count concepts to be or their methodology. So it means that it means that in trying to come to any sort of conclusion, there's necessarily going to be a lot of snuck assumptions or nuances that are missed, and inevitably this is going to be realized by people, at the very least, if they're ever going to have a point of self-reflection upon the way that they intellectually justify these concepts. And yes, broadly, that seems to lead people either towards the agorist path in understanding what libertarianism is, or it leads people further into controlled opposition.
All right, and Nate, you wanted to say something?
So I guess all I can say is that as a mutualist, I have come to the conclusion that we should reject political organization through especially fiat, and of course I'm very supportive of decentralization efforts and mutual aid. And I've come to the understanding, or a much better understanding, that it's not just about no rulers, it's also rejecting uh, the norms that the state had created, as we had, some of what we have probably discussed. And so yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, it's in undermining the ability for rulers to exist, you necessarily undermine the ability for those norms to exist. They're not exclusive.
Though I will give it to you, Eso. Mutualism is pretty anachronistic in its thinking, and I guess because I probably had always been that way, that's probably why I ended up as a mutualist.
There's no problem. There's no problem with that. I mean, as far as mutual credit models go, they're not. I mean, they're causing production to occur outside the white market. They may not themselves be subversive, or have or have the same subversive potential as technological development, but it's nothing to be critical of necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways,
and basically, I hope to make a actual video script in the future about why I don't support capitalism, and not just like only have this live stream. And I'll if you guys want to say something for your outros, I guess you can go ahead. Who wants to go first?
Well, it was, nice being on your stream, Gavi, and I look forward, I guess, maybe to doing more streams in the future. It's just interesting getting back into streaming after not really being active for the last year or so, even in the form of streaming.
I hope we can do a lot more in the future.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, and all I have to say is that prescribed language is cringe. And yeah, thanks for letting me be on the stream. This was enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm glad you were able to be here too. Nate, you want to say anything?
all I can say, it's kind of like the Agora anarchy action thing, but I guess with mutualism, it's freed markets, decentralization, consent, cooperation, mutual aid. So there you go.
And all I could say for my outro is basically fuck fuck political action in any means of the word. political, because because I hate centralization, and yeah, that's about it. That's as simple as it goes. But anyway, guys, I'll see you in the next stream or possibly video.